Some words have been changed to abide by YouTube's censorship. In 2020, when COVID forced the world to stop, a subculture fueled by nostalgia for mid-20th century domesticity gained traction on social media platforms like TikTok. This trend involved women influencers, often with Christian religious backing, returning to a traditional gender role of a domestic housewife performing duties like baking, cleaning, and childcare. It was seen as a reaction against the advancement of feminism's focus on workplace equality, relationship equality, and bodily autonomy. These women were coined tradwives, and before there was Hannah Nealon, a ballerina farm, or Nara Smith, there was a pioneer in this trad influencer movement, and her name is Martha Stewart, and everything Martha did was seen as perfect. She was inspirational and aspirational for so many women. She was a cultural phenomenon, and she brought her homemaking empire to Wall Street to become the first woman self-made billionaire in 1999. No woman had ever risen higher than Martha Stewart, and in the end, no woman had fallen farther. Research material for this video includes the 1997 unauthorized book Just Desserts, written by Jerry Oppenheimer, the 2003 TV movie Martha Incorporated, the story of Martha Stewart, the 2005 sequel Martha Behind Bars, and the Netflix 2024 documentary Martha. At the beginning of the documentary, a question is asked concerning people who change things culturally, who seem to become famous and popular with millions of followers. Did they create the moment, or did the moment create them? In Martha's case, it was both destiny and determinism that led to her enormous success. She understood the changes in American society, and Martha knew what women needed and what they wanted at the time. She redirected women from opening cans of cream of mushroom soup and pouring it on top of broccoli and boiled chicken. She believed homemaking isn't just a chore you begrudgingly finish, but it can be a powerful thing for women. She found a way to fill these voids in women's lives. It was something she believed women needed and wanted and didn't have. Martha never saw herself as a simple homemaker, although she felt she had been attacked for being one. Martha said it is a profession that's been put down for too long. She saw herself not as a traditional woman, but as a modern feminist. She said in the documentary she was maligned for creating a lifestyle that was unattainable, but she didn't think that was true. She said her true goal was to educate. Before Martha, there was Julia Child, who was a trained chef, an author, and television personality who Martha had much in common with. And before Julia Child, there was Betty Crocker, who was voted the second most popular woman by Forbes magazine in 1945, with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt in first place. Fortune magazine also outed Betty Crocker as a fraud. She is a character played over the years by anonymous women on radio, TV, and in cooking classes. However, that has not affected her popularity. Her image has been updated 7 times since 1933 to change with the times, and the woman as a brand is still relevant today. In many ways, Martha Stewart sought to build an image, a brand, similar to Betty Crocker. But there's a big problem. Martha is a real person with a real life, but her brand demanded perfection from the woman trying to build it, perfection from her and from everyone around her. And it was as the documentary stated, Martha bought into this idea of perfection, and the question is not whether perfection is attainable, but at what cost. Martha is asked what she dislikes. She says it's a hard question. She dislikes waste, inefficiency, avoidance, impatience, people who think they can do more than they can do, not paying attention to details, being mean just to be mean, aprons and house dresses, the color purple, but not as much now, and the color red. In the documentary, the camera expands past Martha, sitting in a chair, and behind her, in a no doubt very expensive vase, is a bunch of red flowers right there in her home. She says she doesn't like red things in her garden. If something pops up red, it's usually taken out. So red is another thing I'm not really fond of, she said. It's a sign that perhaps she doesn't have the control she once had in her life. Martha's in her 80s now, and you get the impression of how much work there is for her to do on the farm. She walks alone through her gardens and makes audio notes as she walks. She said there's a saying that she likes. If you want to be happy for a year, get married. If you want to be happy for a decade, get a dog. And if you want to be happy for the rest of your life, make a garden. The book goes through Martha's personal history. Martha's paternal grandfather arrived in New York with knowledge of baking, food preparation, restaurant management, and running a mess hall from his time in the Army. On page 30, Oppenheimer said, one night at a social Polish club, he met Helena Kruker, a pretty teenager 11 years his junior. They fell in love and were married after a short courtship. She worked as a housekeeper for a wealthy New York family, the Oppenheimers, no relation to the writer, and they moved into a crowded apartment building on Madison Avenue between 107 and 108th Street, close to where her parents lived. Edward Rudolph, Martha's father, was born August 21st, 1911, after the birth of a baby girl named Stasia. There was also another child who died, and Helen spent her life grieving over the loss. This was common for children then to die at birth and at a young age. Many children would not live to see their 5th birthdays, and childhood sickness was prevalent. On page 31, Oppenheimer wrote, but like Stasia's, little Eddie's health was poor too. He suffered from innumerable childhood illnesses and ailments, including nosebleeds that caused Helen enormous concern. Helen coddled and spoiled Edward, even as 2 more children were born. Eddie was always her favorite. In 1920, when Frank Costria was 41 and tired of the restaurant work, he wanted to branch out on his own. He moved his family to Jersey City, where they lived amongst a large Polish population. He was a very frugal man and was able to open a butcher shop called Kostria's Meats. The family moved into a 3-bedroom apartment house and joined the local parish church, St. Anne's. The children went to public school, and their father joined a fraternal organization called Society of Sons of Poland Group III. He also aligned himself with the Hudson County Democratic Association, run by Mayor Haig, a political boss who never faced any crime indictment or misdemeanor thanks to his ties in Irish politics. Connected people didn't have to follow laws and were given special privileges. Frank Costria kept favor with the mayor by bribing him with prime cuts of meat and political contributions. He would go on to open other shops and businesses. He took over businesses, built them up, then sold them for a profit. People desperate to own their own businesses were told they could work in a business for a few months before they had to pay him, so they jumped at the deal. But the new owners didn't realize sales were conflated until after they agreed to buy them. Frank also owned real estate. On page 33, it also said he did some loan sharking. Frank bought Billy Marks's Tavern and named it after himself. Although this was during a time of prohibition, the mayor didn't really enforce the national law, and alcohol was sold to the public. The Costria's family moved into an apartment above the tavern. It was big enough for the family, and they lived there for 2 decades. Eddie was smart from a young age and was raised by his mother to believe he was special. Because he was attached to his mother, he learned housewifery skills other boys had no knowledge of. He knew how to cook, garden, sew, and he understood fashion. He was also very artistic and creative. Eddie took after his father in the looks department, with blonde curly hair and blue eyes, and he stood at 6'2". He was also athletic and a handyman. Martha's brother Frank Costria said his father, Eddie, had a photographic mind and could fix anything. He said all the children inherited their father's mind power. On page 35, Frank said we could walk into someone's kitchen and smell something cooking on the stove and pretty much knew what the ingredients were, and we could go home and duplicate it. It's in the blood. It's in the genes. The children graduated from Jersey City's William L. Dickinson High School, where Eddie, nicknamed Curly, was the sole drum major for the marching band and sang with the glee club. He also took up horseback riding and was accepted into an elite cavalry outfit called the Essex Troop. The troop was called to quell a mob of angry strikers, and there was a photo taken of Eddie in the center of the action. He graduated in 1929, and although his family thought he would go on to be a doctor, a gym teacher advised him to go into physical education. He entered Panzer College of Physical Education with his family paying the $275 annual tuition, which would increase in his senior year. He earned a bachelor's degree in physical education. He was the first Kaustria to earn a college degree. Eddie was considered a bookworm. On page 36, Oppenheimer wrote, "Everything he read he took in that brain of his." And besides his studies, he was a talented artist. He understood perfectionism and had an obsession for detail. These success-oriented traits were passed down to Martha. Eddie was more creative than he was athletic. On page 37, Oppenheimer said he was more of a scholar and a dreamer. He decided a European vacation would expand his horizons, and his father paid for a trip to the continent. He began another passion by photographing his journey and told his family he played tennis against the king of Sweden. There were doubts this story was true, and he may have been exaggerating, something he also passed down to Martha. He was working as a gym teacher in Jersey City public school system for several years when he met Martha Ruskowski. This was still the Depression, and there weren't many jobs for people, but the Kaustrias were a connected family. Eddie, however, wasn't satisfied with his job. He wanted bigger things for himself. He went to night school, hoping to move into a more lucrative career. But when these two met, they jumped into a wedding and having children. Eddie felt resentment over the marriage and children because it shattered the dreams he had for his life. He remained very bitter about it. So, as Oppenheimer pointed out, was Martha. She wanted to teach, but was more willing to accept the reality of the situation, where Eddie was not. On page 39, Oppenheimer wrote, "He always had those visions of greatness, and he possessed that inflated ego, and it always got in his way." Martha Sr.'s parents, Joe Ruskowski and Francesca Albiniak, were farming class people who migrated to America after World War I from Poland. They did not meet each other until they moved to America, although they were from towns in Poland close to each other. When Russia tried to force Joe into the Russian army, he fled to settle in Buffalo, New York. Francesca found work in menial labor when she moved to the same area. Neither knew how to speak English, and they were staying in the same boarding house when they met. Joe worked as an iron worker, and the couple had 4 living children, 2 boys and 2 girls. The first child was Martha Sr. That was Martha Stewart's mother. They were raised in a 2-story wood frame house in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. The family were poor and had to take in boarders who lived above or below them. Francesca also worked as a seamstress and taught her daughters how to sew, which Martha Sr. also passed down to Martha Stewart. Although poor, the Ruskowskis were able to pay for their children's continuing education. One son became a lawyer, the other an engineer, and Martha Sr. became a teacher. On page 26, Oppenheimer wrote, "Eddie met Martha Sr., daughter of a Polish immigrant iron worker from Buffalo, at a Polish Heritage Summer Session on the Western Pennsylvania campus of Alliance College, founded and sponsored by the Fraternal Polish National Alliance and funded by some foundation I can't even say that's name. They ran away and eloped on September 7, 1937. They were married by a justice of the peace at a local jail somewhere between Buffalo and New York City. By the time they had a traditional wedding in the church near Christmas time, Martha Sr. was already pregnant. She had a teaching contract when she married in Slogan, New York, and fulfilled her responsibility while pregnant. They moved to Jersey City, and the couple had 6 children: a boy, a girl, Martha Stewart, born on August 3rd, 1941, a boy again, then a girl, then another boy, and finally the youngest girl. Martha Sr. would not return to her role as teacher until her youngest child, Laura, was in kindergarten in the 1960s. The same year Martha was born, the U.S. entered World War II, but Martha's father did not serve overseas. He remained at home and worked in the federal shipyard in dry dock. After the death of Eddie's father, his mother sold the tavern and gave Eddie a down payment on a home in the new suburbs. It was a 3-bedroom, 1-bath, asbestos sided, Depression era house with a full basement, a tiny sewing room, and an unfinished attic, all this for $8,000. Martha was 4 years old when they moved in 1944 to Nutley, where cowgirl Annie Oakley had once been a resident. Mark Twain used to summer there, and Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis' father's family, the Bouviers, once owned a house there. Now it's known to be the place where Martha Stewart grew up. It was the end of the war, and Eddie also lost his job. When Martha was 5 years old, her father became a salesman. People who knew him thought it was a good job for him because he was a real storyteller. He had the ability to embellish and overstate necessities for a salesman. He was also charming, bright, and articulate. He believed in what he sold, and he believed in himself. Since Eddie had a passing knowledge of biology, chemistry, and anatomy, he went into hustling pharmaceuticals. First for Pfizer Incorporated. That company mass-produced penicillin during the war effort. Eddie received a salary, a commission, and a company car. Best of all for Martha, when she was young, was the company hosted a family day during the summer at Coney Island, and she could ride all the rides for free. But Eddie didn't stay at one job and left one for the next that offered a little bit more than the last. At one job, he was fired so the company manager could hire his cousin. Martha Sr. had to work for a while as a teacher until Eddie found his next job. When Eddie did find new work, he made sure the Nutley Sun newspaper reported on his progress. He also set up a small lab in his basement with some of the samples he carried with him, looking for ways to grow better tomatoes or heal his family. He had enough knowledge to be mentioned in the prestigious New England Journal of Medicine and helped out a farmer to heal his cows after they were burned in a fire. But for all of his work, Eddie never made more than $13,000 in his best year. He never felt he reached his potential. On page 45, Oppenheimer wrote, Eddie Kostria's feeling of failure and frustration with his lot in life often manifested itself in the uncontrolled fury that erupted at home, and anger that verged on a word. Martha Stewart's brother Frank said his father had a temper, and he hit the children with a stick or a belt when they, as he said, got out of line. Frank said Eddie kicked Martha in the back, and she hated her father in many respects. She said she would never forgive him. On page 54, Frank maintained that the treatment Martha received from her father made Martha a man-hater. She didn't like male authority then, and she still doesn't. In the documentary, she said she learned to be a perfectionist from her father. She said her father made all the children learn to garden. She said he could grow anything. And out of all the children, Martha was the one who would grow up to be so much more like him, and he knew it. She was his favorite child. He trusted her to iron his linen shirts and to take care of his expensive wardrobe. She also looks the most like him, with the same color, blue eyes, and blonde hair. She said he was the handsomest father, and by proxy, she is complimenting herself. Although she said her father was a perfectionist and finished what he set out to do, she also said he was a failure at work. She said he could have done anything, but he was stuck in a salesman's job, no doubt because he needed an income to support his family. She said he started off the day with a coffee and a large glass of red wine. "Is that an alcoholic?" she asked. "Maybe," she answered. She said he never looked like a drunk, and she had these old, outdated ideas of what alcoholism is. She said he never stumbled around and threw things and broke things, but she said he was dissatisfied, unhappy human being. He couldn't provide enough to feed all 6 of his children, so he made them go out and tend to a garden. Sometimes they would trade some of their produce for items they couldn't grow. Martha said her father stood over the children like a mean sergeant, and when the children didn't do the work the way he wanted them to do, they were whipped with a yardstick. Sometimes they were hit with a belt. Martha's brother, Eric Scott, said to this day he despised gardening. Her father lost his job, there was no money saved, and he had 6 kids to take care of, so he's taken his anger out on his children. Although Martha Sr. would deny it, the book claimed there was also violence between herself and her husband. Frank said he would get in between them when they started fighting, trying to push them apart. They were both opinionated, fiery people, and when they argued, they did it in Polish so the children wouldn't understand what they said to each other. Frank believed it was the reason the children weren't taught the language. Big Martha would threaten Eddie with divorce, and it frightened the children. Eddie also taunted his wife with women like stewardesses he would meet while he traveled, telling her that they were interested in him. Frank said Eddie thought of himself as a ladies' man, which he decidedly was not in his son's eyes. He just liked a lot of attention, and he wanted to make Martha Sr. angry. Regardless of the A word, happening in the house, the book stated the children did not show any emotion or complained about it to anyone. If they cried, it would have been to themselves. This was not the household Martha portrayed in her books and in her magazines. On page 46, Oppenheimer wrote, Martha has regaled millions of readers with delightful stories about the warm and loving family members who nurtured her talents and taught her skills, particularly her father. There was a series on TV the book said Martha mirrored her fake family on, and it was called Father Knows Best. It began as a radio show and later went on to TV for 5 seasons in the 1950s. The show portrayed a family man as a thoughtful and responsible man who loved his wife and children, with a mother who was the voice of reason. The show became ingrained in American pop culture that presented what a family should be. But the family was fictitious and were played by actors. It wasn't real, but Martha's family was real. The fake teenage girl, Betty Anderson, was a role model for Martha, and she loved the show. Her family was flawed and dysfunctional and not like the ideal fake family. There are many dangers in idolizing a fake person, having a parasocial relationship with a celebrity, and believing in the mythical qualities that person you believe possesses. Looking back at Martha's books and reading about her childhood, it seems that Martha was building this fantasy world. But as the Oppenheimer book pointed out on page 52, it worked at the time. It helped her sell her books. Publicity always was a priority for Eddie, as it would be for his famous daughter. Martha dedicated her book, Entertaining, in part to my father for instilling in me a love for all things beautiful. Martha and brother Frank fought often growing up and never really got along. He said she developed a hate syndrome, always complaining about she hated this person or that. Frank said the reason why they fought so much was Martha wanted things her way and he wanted things his way. He said the leadership roles his father instilled in his children was as a leader, you always got your way, and they followed his philosophy. Martha said even though they made their clothes, they used very fine fabric they found in bargain stores. Her father wore Harris tweed suits and Prima cotton shirts. Even though her family didn't have money, they still enjoyed good food, good clothes, and good taste. But Martha didn't have the luxury she saw other children have. When she didn't walk home for lunch, she brought a bologna sandwich wrapped in wax paper in a brown bag with her. She didn't have a few pennies to buy ice cream for dessert in the cafeteria. After school, all the children had 7 cents to buy popsicles from the Good Humor Man. On page 57, Oppenheimer wrote, as Martha has acknowledged, she was brought up with the save for tomorrow mentality. In the first movie, Martha's mother tells a young Martha she is just like her father, and Martha tells her not to say that. There seems to be a dichotomy in the way Martha feels about her father. A part of her is grateful, at least on the surface, for teaching her these skills she would later use in her business, and she could see how she inherited his determination, but he also left her with horrible memories of being A-worded. Although it's doubtful, she would acknowledge the damage he did to her. Big Martha was not very affectionate with anyone, including her own children. The home atmosphere was very stern. School became a refuge from her home life, and when Martha attended Yantakal Elementary School, that she developed a bond with one of her teachers, Irene Wire. Other teachers were stern old maids, while Wire had a very alluring personality and a beautiful style. Martha said in later years she was beautifully groomed. She was loving, and her classroom was filled with laughter and fun. Wire was attractive and feminine. Martha became her prized pupil and took the young girl under her wing. Martha was competitive and an achiever at a very young age. The first movie portrayed her very competitive personality, and she sold baked items when she was young because she needed money. Martha, at 9 years old, purposely gave a young girl a bad cake recipe so she could take a job from her. The book also had this same story in it. Martha learned that a young girl was also interested in catering, and she went over to the girl's house offering to help her in a very frenemy way. The girl needed a recipe for chocolate cake, and Martha happily gave her one. Well, the cake turned out flat and hard like cardboard. Crying, the girl called the woman to let her know, but the woman told her not to bother. Martha was already at the door with a replacement cake all ready. Martha was compared to the wicked little girl in the Bad Seed movie. Outside, she was all sweetness, but inside, she had a killer instinct, and anyone who tried to compete with her would regret it. At the age of 10, Martha worked as a babysitter for people including Mickey Mantle, Yogi Berra, and Gil McDougald, all players for the New York Yankees. She also organized birthday parties for them. The fifth Castria child, George, was born in 1952 and was a year old when Martha entered middle school. Martha had no privacy in her house. The sixth Castria child, Laura, was born to Martha Sr. when she was 41. Being the oldest daughter, Martha was a second mother to the smallest children. The siblings had a rocky relationship, and some believe it stemmed from the feelings of resentment Martha had because she was forced to take care of her younger siblings when she was a teenager. Through it all, Martha studied, maintained superior grades, and kept up with her household chores. She became obsessed with cleanliness and being a perfectionist in everything she did. She also was an insomniac and often only had 4 hours of sleep a night. The fatigue she felt gave her this walled-eyed, slightly crazy look, which remained with her. By the time Martha entered Nutley High School, Martha was a pretty teenager, exposed to upper-middle-class affluence for the first time. Other girls had fathers like lawyers and bankers, and they could afford the latest fashions and makeup bought in New York department stores. Martha couldn't do that. What she could do was dream about the good life she would one day have, and she could read. She loved fashion magazines as a form of escapism. Although Martha would claim she read many classics, other people remember she liked pulp fiction like Nancy Drew and later Battle Cry and Peyton Place. She did not idolize teen stars like other young girls who had posters on their walls. She did not like rock and roll at all. She considered it garbage and knew her father would not allow her to play that kind of music at home. Martha was not from her own generation. She acted more like someone from her parents' time. On page 65, the book quoted a school friend of hers, claiming Martha had about as much interest in cooking as any of us did. Zero. Cooking, or at least helping her mother cook, was one of Martha's chores at home. She had to do it, or she would have gotten hell. If home economics hadn't been mandatory, Martha wouldn't have come within 100 feet of that classroom, just like other teen girls. It was a class that taught them chores their mothers were forced to do, and daughters did not want to end up like their mothers. The home ec teacher actually had the students cut maraschino cherries into 1/8 for one recipe. The students thought it was crazy. On page 66, a student recalled, Martha said something I'll never forget in the light of who she's become. Martha said, "That's all my mother does, stand in front of a hot stove cooking. And what does she have to show for it? She works like a peasant. I want more out of life, and I'm going to get it." Martha was always disciplined, but she became even more so in high school and studied for tests right up until the moment she took them. She was highly ambitious and competitive and voted most likely to succeed in her class. Martha also began writing and editing in Nutley High's literary quarterly, The Gauntlet, but her writing was considered simple and her art direction was uninspiring. In a book review of Thackeray's Vanity Fair, she panned it in a review, calling it overlong and shallow reading, and it was dated. Perhaps Martha saw something of herself in the Becky Sharp character and didn't want to admit to her social climbing ambitions. Martha was a student in honors English class taught by Mrs. Hoffer, a graduate of Barnard, and she was considered one of the best teachers in the school system. She believed Martha to be an able student, competent, and very efficient, but nothing extraordinary. Martha had a lot of extracurricular activities and she was always on the run, but she never opened herself up to others and was rather reclusive. Martha knew her family would not have money for college, so she pushed herself in classes like calculus, hoping it would make a difference in scholarship money. She became a little helper for everyone: the dean, the guidance counselor, the main office, the Red Cross, the art club, the Latin club, the girls' sporting club, the debating club, the chemistry club, the bowling club, on and on. The activities didn't take up much of her time, and they looked impressive on her resume. Her brother George, who took his wife's name after they married, said Martha had a lot of her father in her, and he would help her with school projects. They were both Leos, both very strong willed individuals. She didn't waste time having fun, and she didn't try out for the cheerleading squad. She did help cater meals for football games and later took sole credit for breakfast catered for them. Other people remembered it was Martha Sr. feeding 30 guys at her home. Martha entered modeling in 1958, and although she said the mother of a friend made the introductions, the movie said Eddie pushed her into it and was the one who took hundreds of photographs of her. Martha's father tells her that the money she earns is still his money. Her father grabbed a glamour magazine Martha had in her hand and opened it up. "You think life is like what they have in these magazines? This is junk," he said. He told her there isn't one girl in the magazine half as good looking as she is. Martha smiled. Her father did not compliment her much. Quite the reverse. He certainly should have. He should have told his children how proud he was of them. The movie portrayed her father starting Martha's career by taking pictures of her, but in reality, young women are introduced into the circle of fashion, and they are usually from wealthier homes. Martha had an astuteness at a young age to find people who would lift her up out of her family working class background. And although Martha wanted to model, she was worried about the competition. Most models come from wealthier, connected families, and she had to do it on her own. She had to find time in her busy life to also travel to New York, but she did it. She had a wholesome look, that worked in her favor when a Manhattan modeling agency signed her and she started modeling at Bonwit Teller on Saturdays. She also appeared in a 30-second Lifebuoy soap TV commercial and for Unilever. She did an ad for Terraton cigarettes. Later in college, she appeared in ads for Chanel. She was seen as a natural kind of girl who could do anything. But Martha wasn't from New York. Martha was from Jersey, with that accent and fast talk to match. Commercial producers dubbed her words using a professional voice. Regardless, people were very happy for her and in awe of her. She would later change her speech to that waspy way of talking she now has. Others saw it as a big thing and were jealous of her. Martha did not win Queen at the 1958 dance in the Nutley High Gymnasium, but she was one of 4 runner-ups which made it into the newspaper. In the documentary, Martha said most of her paycheck went to her mother. Her mother was an excellent cook, and with Martha's paychecks, they could eat good food. And Martha learned from her mother how to cook and sew. She also learned the process of canning and preserving from visits with her grandparents in Buffalo, New York. Martha said her mother was a school teacher and she had to cook 16 meals a day. In the first movie, Martha was also very motivated in high school and read Business Weekly magazine about a woman who created Tupperware, and she was a single mother. She wouldn't have to work if she stayed married, a young girl said to Martha. Martha pointed out the Tupperware business owner had 2 secretaries and owned her own empire. The girls called Martha a lesbian for being so business promoted, and she didn't have a boyfriend. She was involved with multiple clubs hoping to get into a good college. For all her beauty and success, Martha had little interest in boys. She didn't flirt with them, and many found her cold and intimidating. What few boys she did date had to meet her standards for social acceptability. They had to be good looking and from a good family. The fathers had to be bankers and doctors. They had to live in the best part of town, and they had to be as driven as she was. As for boys, they found Martha had a pretty face, but she was very skinny, like a beanpole. She made a good impression on the parents, but she did not get tied up with any boy. She was goal oriented, and her father found fault with any boy she dated. When she graduated from high school, she didn't even have an escort to the senior prom. A friend of hers managed to find another boy, still single, and matched them up. Martha made her own prom dress and graduated in the top 10% of her class. She hoped to become friends with Connie Francis, a singer of some hit songs during that time, whose family, the Italian Franconeros, lived in an enclave of Nutley. Martha believed getting in good with Connie's brother George would be enough to enter that world. On page 81, Oppenheimer quoted a friend of hers saying Martha was socially aware of that sort of thing even then, being with the right people. Martha was very aware of social status. She threw a party for George, but he didn't invite his sister Connie, nor did he make any introduction. So Martha lost interest in George very quickly. People had the impression with Martha that she only liked a guy if there was something in it for her. Her hustling did pay off because she was awarded a full scholarship to NYU and a partial scholarship to Barnard, the school of Martha's choice. She went for the partial scholarship and went to the college she wanted. She also received a scholarship from the Nutley Rotary Club, which amounted to $400. Her personal inscription in the class book said, "I do what I please and I do it with ease." In the documentary, she graduated from Nutley High School, and in 1960, Martha had a scholarship to attend Barnard College, originally planning to major in chemistry, but switching to art, history, and later architecture history. Martha said she loved college, particularly classes in history, art history, and economics. She was a very popular girl on campus, and people knew who she was, a tall blonde, very pretty from New Jersey. She was very chic. She was looking for adventure. She was looking toward the future, and although she didn't say it, she was looking for a future man to marry and help uplift her from her working class life into a wealthier one. Martha's first experiences in college that linger with her the most was not about having a social life, but the exotic foods she was introduced to from the students she came across. It was her first time experiencing Polynesian cuisine. There was so much happening in the country in 1969, the civil rights movement, Vietnam, the space race. Bernard was a highly political school. Students were having peace marches and protesting segregation. Not for Martha. Her family supported Kennedy, but they were not liberals. Martha never had a black friend, and not until high school would she attend school with any black students, of which there were only 4 in her graduating class. Martha's world had always been white, and she lived in a bubble. She did find at least one reason to protest. When the college attempted to ban wearing Bermuda shorts on campus, she and a friend were photographed looking very preppy in theirs. Martha was on a very heavy load of 5 courses per semester, equaling 15 credits or more. This was made harder on her because she commuted to college from home her first year, and she used the 2-hour trip to study. And next to her classes, her main focus was her modeling career. She often had to borrow designer clothes because she had very little of her own. The reason those jobs paid so well was because the models had to pay for their own wardrobe. Every fall, Glamour magazine selected 10 best dressed college girls in America. Martha felt she had a shot and sent in her application, and naturally she won a spot. This was a very big deal in those days, not only for the model, but for the college she represented. The full page photograph not only described her as a young woman with tenderness and vitality, but also mentions a certain young man named Andy who brought pleasure to her life. Andy was not the first college boy she dated. On page 91, Martha said there were a few fun seeking boys from South America, Argentina, and Europe who had big allowances and took her to the El Morocco for night clubbing. But it was hardly glamorous, and the dates were often set up for her by her classmates. Boys found her intimidating and cold. She was hardly one to waste time with playboys or explore herself sexually, or with recreational substances. She did attend some hip parties, but she had high goals for herself. Plus, she was Catholic. She wanted to be popular, but she wasn't willing to experiment with her freedom to achieve it that way. In Greek art class in 1960, a young woman from a prominent family named Deanne Love, who was recently married to Stanley Love, a man who made a fortune in children's wear, noticed Martha and thought she would be a possible date interest for her brother Andy, who was in his first year of law school. He was 6'4" and charming and could probably get dates on his own, but he didn't dissuade his sister from helping him on the chance she could come across someone interesting. Later, she saw Martha in the library, and just on impulse, Deanne approached her and asked if she would like to meet her brother. She showed Martha a picture of Andy that she kept in her wallet, but Martha was more impressed by Deanne than Andy's photo. Deanne drove a Jaguar to college and wore designer clothes like Dior and Balenciaga. So Martha gave her the number and Deanne passed it on to her brother. Later, his sister would have mixed feelings about the introduction, but she did it with the best of intentions. On page 129, Oppenheimer made an acute statement about Martha and the women she gravitated towards. Speaking to a former friend of Martha named Kathleen Tatlock, she said she was the kind of woman to whom Martha had always been attracted to. She was pretty, creative, and of good pedigree. She was also married to a prominent man. In the documentary, Martha noticed a girl who was driven to school in a Rolls Royce, and all the girls in college were quite amazed at that level of wealth. She said the girl came up to her and said she had a brother who was in Yale School, and would you care to have a date with him? Of course she would. That's what college was for then, to meet a wealthy and successful man to build a life with. Where the Costias lived in a small home with simple comforts, the Stewarts were adventurous nomads who traveled frequently, dragging their children with them. They were extremely wealthy, but had no formal higher education. Father George had an obsession with travel, and Mother Ethel had an obsession with decorating. They were loving parents, but immature in many ways, including their parenting skills, and raised their children in a very impractical way. George was Russian Jewish and worked playing the stock market. There are stories on page 97 where stock deals with him turned sour and other people were left holding the bag. The Stewarts had financial problems like the Costias, but where the Costias worried about affording milk, the Stewarts were concerned about where their next tin of caviar would come from. Ethel came from England and she was a devout Christian Scientist who dominated the household. Annie was often mistaken for being Jewish, but he was not. Ethel's decorating was similar to designs found in a sultan's palace and was described as idiosyncratic. She claimed she was comfortable in grandeur. Andy was born on February 8, 1938. He was 3.5 years older than Martha. Growing up, Andy's parents moved to 9 different apartments so his mother could keep decorating. He found her constant need to decorate confining and didn't realize until later that he married a woman who had a commonality with his mother. Andy complained after his divorce that he couldn't sit anywhere because everything was all too precious. Andy also never received gifts from his family for celebrations like his birthday. He was in college before he received a birthday gift from his friend. His parents were considered eccentric. If you're poor and you act like that, then you're crazy. When you're rich, then you're eccentric. The children were often uprooted and dragged from one adventure to another by George, sometimes including a motor odyssey through 48 states or a European jaunt. The couple dropped off the children in affluent boarding schools where their former education was stunted due to their parents' whims. Eventually, Andy finished 8th grade at the North County School in Lake Placid, New York, and went on to Putney School in New York, where he had his first girlfriend in 10th grade. Andy graduated in June 1955 and wanted to go to Harvard, but settled for the University of Virginia. He loved the outdoors more than he loved the classroom and had to work hard to compete with the conservative students that surrounded him. But he still had time to date plenty of young women, and he was popular with them. He graduated in June 1959 and moved on to Yale to study law. Andy had more than a few casual girlfriends he was involved with when he finally called Martha to set up a date with her. In January 1960, Martha had moved into her own place in Manhattan. To afford her new living space, she applied to Bernard for a position as full-time maid and cook for 2 elderly sisters. Andy was crazy for Martha the minute he saw her. He was easily infatuated with women, but not very perceptive about them. They had an ease with each other that Andy found surprising from the very beginning. Martha stated later that Andy fell in love with her on that first date. She claimed she never read any F. Scott Fitzgerald novels and didn't realize she was supposed to lead men on. They continued to see each other as Andy spent the summer traveling while Martha worked. The elderly sisters had a nephew in his 40s who became interested in Martha. She found him one day in the room the sisters gave to her, and she told them about it. He was kept away from Martha after that. It took a while for Andy to understand the different lifestyles he and Martha lived. When he realized she couldn't afford the $17 train ticket to see him, he paid for the tickets so they could spend time together. Andy had his own first-floor apartment with a friend of his. Martha went to stay with Andy, and Andy told Martha he loved her, so they were intimate for the first time. Andy was concerned proposing to a girl who had such devoted ties to the Catholic Church. He was not parochial himself and doubted he could live his life with someone like that. She did not open up and discuss her thoughts on God or religion, but simply stopped practicing Catholicism altogether. When Andy traveled to Nutley to meet her family, everyone was friendly to him except Martha's father. When Andy picked up Laura and put her on his knee, Eddie accused him of being too affectionate with her. He didn't say it directly to Andy, but he told Martha later, who also told Andy later. Andy felt sick to his stomach about it. In the documentary, Andy Stewart was seen as a beam of light in Martha's life. She said he was nothing like her father. She said he sent her money every week to visit him at Yale, and although Martha was a virgin, she slept with him. She said he was very aggressive, but she liked it. It's doubtful she would have slept with him without the understanding that they would marry in the near future. Yes, she was a modern woman, but not that modern. He was her only lover. Of course, he proposed, and being in love, it seemed the most natural thing in the world for the two to marry. In the first movie, Martha also made her family to sound like they were richer than they actually were. Even Polish nobility, artists, and educators. Who knew Jersey could be so sophisticated? Andy's mother said. In the documentary, Martha said she met Andrew Stewart, who finished his law degree at Yale Law School. She said he picked her up in a yellow Mercedes sedan, and she had never been in a Mercedes before. She said he was very polite and handsome. He had also traveled a lot, which Martha had not done but wanted to do. He seemed so sophisticated in her young eyes. He even had an American Express card, and she said that was a big deal then. After that first dinner, Martha was madly in love. In the first movie, Martha was getting ready for a competition in Glamour magazine. And a couple of years previously, a girl named Norma Collier did it. And she was on the cover of every magazine, and that's where Martha wanted to be. Plus, she would love to go to Paris. Modeling is very competitive. So Martha had to stop her plans of going to Paris to marry Andy, but she knew she would get to travel by marrying him, and he was soon to graduate from law school. Andy proposed to Martha in February 1961, but he didn't get the answer he was expecting. On page 108, Oppenheimer wrote Martha was cautious and reluctant. She felt they were too young, and she wanted to follow her modeling career to Paris, where she hoped a feature story she submitted to Glamour magazine would be chosen. Andy later agreed that they were young and innocent, and if they waited 5 or 6 years to experience life, it may have been possible that Martha may have changed and he wouldn't want her anymore. Martha later claimed that Andy drove to her dorm to throw stones at her window and drove her around Central Park until she agreed to marry him. Oppenheimer thought Martha was exaggerating because at the time she was living on an upper floor on a Columbia University campus, but the essence of her story was true. Martha finally agreed to marry him in March 1961. In the documentary, when she told her father, his response was to slap her. He slapped her hard on the face and said, "No, you're not going to marry him. He's a Jew." She said she was not surprised because she knew he was a bigot and he was impulsive, meaning he lashed out at her without realizing Martha was marrying a lawyer from a wealthy family. Martha stood up to her father and told him she would marry Andy anyways. In the book, Eddie referred to Andy as a half-Jew. Eddie thought Martha was crazy. Andy was not Jewish, and his father changed his last name to Stewart to protect them from anti-Semitism still seen in America. For Martha, the last name Stewart was waspy and of higher status than her own Kostia Polish Catholic last name. It became a very appropriate brand name for her. Martha would also play up his Jewish roots whenever it suited her, even though he wasn't. And it can't be ignored that Martha wanted to marry a wealthy young man when Andy came along. She did assume his family was loaded and she would be set for life through marriage. He would elevate her up in the world. To celebrate their engagement, Andy and Martha went to Vermont, where Martha tried skiing for the first time and twisted her ankle. She blamed her parents for not having the money or time for the social sports of the rich. No tennis, skiing, water skiing, or sailing. Diane also threw a very adult party for the newly engaged couple with white damask cloths and silver candlesticks, an introduction to wealth for Martha. The couple planned a small, non denominational wedding for the summer of 1961. Andy chose a $1,000 diamond ring from Harry Winston, but when he presented it to Martha, she rejected it and told him she wanted something nicer and she would choose it for herself. He returned the ring to the jeweler. They went to a diamond wholesaler, and Martha chose a slightly larger diamond in a better setting and negotiated a price for it. His friends considered this a bad omen. Martha and her mother designed and made her wedding dress, while some of her friends threw her a small bridal shower. Her dress may seem simple, but it consisted of 4 layers of Swiss organdy, and Martha hand-stitched that long row of buttons down her back. They were married July 1st, 1961. Annie chose the music, and Martha carried a bunch of wild daisies as her bouquet. She wrote little cards to her family, and there were no formal portraits. Regardless, Martha said she was very happy on her wedding day. She said it was the beginning of her life. They had a short honeymoon in Vermont, and they moved into an Upper East Side penthouse in Manhattan. But it was only a 2-month temporary accommodation from a friend of Andy's. Martha continued to model, and Andy worked for a prestigious law firm, waiting to finish law school. And he didn't have any plans per se for their lives, but he did assume Martha would model, then maybe go into teaching, and they would live a quiet, traditional life together. In the first movie, Martha finds out after the marriage, when they go apartment hunting, that Andy's father does not have the money she thought he did. He lost money in the stocks. His parents had to move out of their own home. Are you kidding? Martha asks. No, Andy explained. A lot of people got hit. The market just took the biggest dive since 1929. Martha had not completed her education, and she paused hers until Andy finished his degree so they would not be apart. Not only that, but Andy decided to share a home with a couple who would be considered artistic hippies in their time. Basically not Martha's kind of people, but Andy thought they were great. The male friend of Andy's later said he could see how Andy doted on Martha for the 9 months they lived together. Andy graduated in June 1962, but he still had to finish at Columbia with his master's in law. He found work as a researcher at a well-known law firm, making about $4 an hour. They could only afford a cheap apartment near the Columbia campus, basically a dump with roaches. Martha hated it there. Andy would say later, Martha became depressed living in that apartment with no money. They tried adopting 3 little parrots who fit in a cage Martha found in a junk shop. They let them out to fly in the apartment when they were home, but reportedly all 3 died from slamming into doors and windows. Her hit and mostly missed modeling jobs brought in a little money, but sometimes she would go for weeks without a job. In January 1964, Andy finished his graduate law program. Martha was also scheduled to graduate that June with her Bachelor of Arts. To celebrate, they decided to have an extended trip to Europe, and there is no explanation how they were able to afford it. Martha Sr. said she wanted to buy a Volkswagen, and little Martha said she and Andy could buy one in Germany for them for $900 while they were in Europe. This allowed the couple to travel with a free vehicle. In the documentary, their honeymoon was a 5-month extended trip through Europe, which no doubt Martha wanted. She kept a complete diary of everything they did, everywhere they went, and what they ate. She said it was eye-opening. No one was sophisticated back home, and all the food, in particular, was exotic and delicious. She loved all the architecture and the gardens. Martha said it awakened in her a love of cuisine, a love of travel, of discovery, and this is what she would like to spend her life thinking about. On page 122, Oppenheimer wrote, but Martha's published memories painted a happier picture than what really transpired. In many ways, the Stewarts' grand tour was troublesome, both emotionally and physically. In Florence, Martha began speaking to an Englishman sitting next to her and Andy, and all three were drinking and getting along very well. Andy wanted to call it a night at about 11 o'clock, and Martha refused, so Andy went up to their room while Martha and the Englishman took off. It was well past midnight when Martha returned and claimed they went to a midnight mass at the cathedral. In the documentary, on a stay in Florence, Italy, she said she had to go to the cathedral. She said Andy was back in the hotel room and didn't have any interest in going to the Duomo with her. He had traveled before, and maybe he had already seen it or wasn't as interested in seeing it as Martha was, so she went there alone. She said listening to the music in that amazing cathedral, it was a very romantic place, and amongst a group of tourists, she said she met this very handsome guy. She said he didn't know she was married. She said in the documentary that it was Easter, and she was this waif of a girl who caught the attention of a man. She said they were both emotional, and the cathedral was beyond anything she had ever experienced. And she asked why not kiss a stranger? There was a moment of silence in the documentary. The reporter starts, were you being, what's the word I'm looking for? Naughty, Martha offers. She looks away from him. Was it naughty or was it infidelity? The reporter asks. Neither, Martha concluded. It was neither naughty nor she stumbles over the word unfaithful. It was just emotion, she concluded, of the moment. That's how I looked at it. And it was exciting, she continued. I mean, it was a very emotional place. I wish we could all experience such an evening. Andy knew Martha found the man attractive, but believed her story. Still, he questioned how much she really cared for him and whether she was emotionally committed to him. The next day, she became very sick, and as the week went on, she became even worse. After one physician refused to care for Martha fully, Andy found another English couple with a wife nurse who was able to give her the medication she needed, and Martha felt better. They returned home and gave up the apartment for Martha's old room until they found another apartment. In the documentary, Martha said she was only 19 years old at the time of the trip, but she was actually a few years older, 22, 23. She said she didn't even want to go home. She said they returned to New York and reality came crashing down. They decided on a very expensive $250 a month 6-room apartment in the genteel Riverside Drive building. They could not afford it, but they wanted it all, and they didn't want to wait. The pressure to make money, and a lot of it was on them. The do-it-yourself projects in the apartment seemed to be what cemented the relationship between Martha and Andy. They bought furniture from auction houses with the help of Andy's mother. Ethel infected Martha with antiques and auction fever. Martha was still modeling but thought about going back to college for her master's degree. Andy was studying for his bar exam and working at Webster and Sheffield, the same law firm he was paid to do research with. She had hoped her modeling career would have advanced farther than it did, and finally she left Andy behind to take a stab at her career in Paris. But Martha didn't have the look they wanted, and she didn't have any assignments for a month. Later, Martha would never admit defeat to others. She simply made excuses. Martha could make a living, but she was never going to be a supermodel. In America, Cheryl Tiegs and Sybil Shepherd were big modeling stars, and Martha looked similar to them, but still she couldn't reach their level. She claimed she made $35,000 in the mid-60s, but some thought she exaggerated. Another model who did earn that much said she may have made around 20,000. After New Year's 1965, the Stewarts announced that Martha was pregnant. She was 23. She and Andy threw themselves into designing a nursery, which seemed to make her happier than the prospect of having a baby. However, she acted pleased, and she had no fears over the pregnancy. Alexis Gilbert was born September 27, 1965. They hired a housekeeper and a babysitter, a budding actress at the time named Valerie Harper. Martha tried to get Lexi, their nickname for Alexis, modeling work at 3 months old, particularly with Johnson & Johnson, who pay well. But she wasn't the blonde-haired, blue-eyed baby they prefer. In the first movie, when Martha found out she was pregnant, she was not happy. She said she couldn't take care of her child right now with her searching for work. Andy tells her he was working, but Martha said he doesn't make any money. This is not how it's supposed to be, she said. Life is not as easy as she thought how Andy said it would be. Martha did not want to end up like her mother, raising a house full of kids in the suburbs and a working-class drunk husband. In the documentary, Martha soon became pregnant and her daughter Alexis was born. She said it was normal to be a young mother. She assumed being a mother was just natural. It would somehow naturally just come to her. Martha said it turned out it's not at all natural to be a mother. It was hard for her to adapt to being a mother. She had to wait for Alexis to go to sleep to have time of her own. The documentary said Martha took care of Alexis and saw to her needs, but she didn't dote on her. Martha was called a chilly mother. She was never good at expressing her emotions. Big Martha, Martha's mother, believed she didn't hug Martha enough when she was growing up. Martha said they didn't talk about feelings. It just wasn't part of her family. She said they were loved obtusely. Dear Lord, what a word to use. When they were supposed to be loved. I mean, she continued, there was not a lot of affection in the house. She said it was more about the everyday, practical. In the documentary, she questioned how she could have been a great mother without the education to be a mother. And more than that, how could she show her child love and affection when she herself never received it as a child? And Martha remained very ambitious. People who knew Martha could see she was very driven and she would drag her new family with her. Oppenheimer complained about Martha and Andy being these educated liberals, which they're not liberal really, but they followed a more modern book on child raising at the time by him, called Between Parent and Child, New Solutions to Old Problems. The older beliefs on child rearing found in Dr. Spock's books were criticized by many feminists at the time, and for good reason. His book, published in 1946, called Baby and Child Care, continually referred to the baby as he, since that is what Spock assumed parents would want, a boy. He also enforced the patriarchal family structure and placed all child care duties on subordinate women who were expected to stay at home. Spock's wife, Jane, also contributed significantly to the book without receiving a credit, and the book was revised in 1976. The Stewarts followed Guénot's parenting that taught empathetic and disciplined communication to strengthen parent-child relationships, focusing on acknowledging feelings, setting limits, and avoiding threats, bribes, and sarcasm. Oppenheimer wanted to point to this liberal book for Martha and Andy's seeming inability to properly parent their child. In his conservative viewpoint, it was no way to raise the best and the brightest, which is the only goal for anyone's progeny. It just didn't seem possible for these two to communicate with their child when they didn't seem to be able to communicate with each other. Instead, Lexi was given free rein, where she acted out at times in front of friends, and Martha and Andy seemed unable to handle her. Children aren't made with manuals. You can't just follow instructions and everything will work out right. It's hard to say what was really attributing to this, but Andy and Martha would not have any more children together. And make no mistake, No matter how many times Oppenheimer tried to point to Martha and Andy as some sort of liberal couple, in every way they were conservative. They were wealthy, connected, white, upper class, who spent time exclusively with their own kind. The men were just like Andy, and the women were ambitious just like Martha. They lived in a bubble of elitism, and their main goal was to make a lot of money. In December 1965, Martha threw a Christmas bash, her first ever, and invited everyone to baked ham, Polish sausages, biscuits, muffins, quiche, oysters, brie, table wine, champagne, and eggnog. People wanted to see the baby, but Martha never brought Lexi out like other mothers do. Someone said Lexi was this shadowy figure who was never in the forefront in the Stewart household. In other modern families, babies were the center of attention. Martha was not of her generation, and her home was not child focused. Lexi did not rule their world, and she was dragged along in the parents' decision making. Martha and Andy bought a weekend getaway home near Middlefield and named the home after the village in a very waspy way. Martha would paint a glowing and loving portrait of the 5 years they spent restoring the house and property. But Oppenheimer believed the decision to buy Middlefield had been a mistake. Nearly every weekend, the couple bundled their daughter up and loaded the car to make a 400-mile round trip drive. They were under enormous pressure to get the work done, and they often fought, with Martha nagging and nitpicking Andy the entire way. He didn't do this right or that right. They turned it into a lovely place, but it did considerable damage to a marriage that was never too secure to begin with. Friends of theirs said Martha was the decision maker in the relationship, and Andy went along with what she wanted. She sold all this as some kind of alternative lifestyle. For the majority of people, that means choosing non traditional ways of living like van life, houseboats, utes, tiny homes, co housing communities, homesteading, or nomadism as a way of prioritizing freedom, sustainability, lowering costs, and finding personal freedom over consumerism, and overall finding personal fulfillment and self sufficiency. It's a minimalist and slow living kind of mindset. Although Martha tried to convince people she was striving to be some sort of pioneer woman who finds comfort in rural life, quite the opposite was true. First of all, this cosplay lifestyle is very expensive to replicate. It's extremely time consuming, particularly for Martha's lifestyle, and it can be very stressful and emotionally demanding, particularly when two people are trying to keep up this aesthetic image. On page 134, Oppenheimer said, "At first, everything Martha and Andy did seemed to be a shared experience," an observer noted. They were like the perfectly matched couple. But then the control began to shift to Martha. She became the dominant one, Andy the submissive one. It was becoming and eventually became a sadomasochistic type of relationship. Martha was on top and Andy was the bottom. At least part of this fluctuation had to do with finances. On page 144, when Andy became an associate at Webster, Sheffield, he was earning a little more than $15,000 a year. Not a bad sum in the mid-60s, but not enough for Martha. She had not married into money the way she had expected, and Martha came from poor roots, and having security was paramount. The reason the Stewarts lost their money in 1962 was the stock market took the sharpest dive since 1929, and George Stewart lost his shirt. He always invested heavily on margin, and when he died, his estate was valued at zero. Martha realized she would have to make her own money. Her father-in-law worked on Wall Street, and Martha and Andy had invested wedding present money they received in the stock market. The firm that hired her, Monets, Williams and Siddall, was new, but was also known for hiring offbeat people. Martha had the qualities they looked for: hungry, aggressive, intelligent, and alert. You didn't have to be a brain surgeon to peddle stocks. You had to be a good salesperson. On page 146, Oppenheimer said all Martha had to do to sell stock was take a broker's exam, and she passed with flying colors in 3 months. She was formally registered with the New York Stock Exchange as a stockbroker in August 1968, right after she celebrated her 27th birthday. Her starting salary was $100 a week plus her share of a commission pool. She would go on to become one of the firm's star salespeople, with some saying her income ran as high as $250,000. Martha herself claimed her salary was as high as $135,000 and compared it to a medium lawyer salary. Either way, that's a lot of money and more money than Andy was making at the time. Some of her friends knew she was a very creative and talented person and saw her chase of money as being a sellout. On page 148, Kathy Tatlock said, Martha had dreams, but she became impatient and abandoned those dreams because she could make a lot of money fast as a stockbroker. Her ambition was so powerful, and that has continued to be her MO. To Martha, the end has always justified the means. Martha was also among a group of very rich and powerful men, and she was living this fast jet-set life with them. She greatly enjoyed this life and was pursued by some of these men. The documentary dropped a bit of a bombshell. Didn't you have an affair while you were working as a stockbroker? Yeah, she explained in the documentary. But I don't think Andy ever knew about that. He did know it, the reporter explained. He did? Martha appeared shocked. The reporter said Andy told him that Martha confessed it to him at some time, but she didn't recall, and Andy claimed after she told him about her infidelity that he started to have affairs of his own after she had hers. Martha said that wasn't true. She said she had a very brief affair with a very attractive Irishman. She said it was nothing to break up the marriage over. She repeats over and over that it was nothing, like the kiss in the cathedral. The book talks about an Irish man who also sold stock for the same company, but it's not clear if it's the same man. He was from a working class background, and the book emphasized he was something else, but it could be just a coincidence. Also, one of her bosses at the firm she worked for was Irish and found Martha attractive, but again, it's not clear if it was him or not. There were not many, if any, women on Wall Street then and now. There weren't even women clerks or women working the exchange. They didn't even have a ladies' room. But Martha was beautiful and blonde and ambitious. She was the only woman at the firm, and by the looks of the photos, she felt very special being the only woman in a group of men. It gave her an edge over the competition. In the documentary, she said she had to push a few men off of her sometimes, and said she saw things happen in the back of taxis she didn't want to talk about. But she was surrounded by very smart and very connected men, and she learned a lot from them. Maybe ethically, she didn't learn so well. Martha always dressed well and put on a good appearance with the clients. She said she learned how to behave around billionaires. She said then to be a billionaire was very rare. Well, it still is. As far as the care for Lexi, from the age of 2.5, she was sent to a nursery located near their apartment, and the housekeeper, Elsie, helped for the rest of the day. Sometimes Martha had to leave for work late or come home early. Andy sometimes helped out at the nursery, too. Later, Lexi would enter a very expensive progressive Rudolf Steiner school. As the book said on page 149 from the start, Lexi seemed happy at the school, which she attended through kindergarten, and her parents had a good feeling about Steiner, especially because it was artsy and gave Lexi the freedom to express herself. Martha told an audience many years later that she regretted not having more children, but a friend of hers at the time said Martha felt one child was enough. She was happy with one. She had the feeling if anyone wanted more children, it was Andy. The book claimed Martha gave Lexi's pram or stroller to Kathy Tatlock, and usually people don't give away those kind of children necessities like that unless they don't plan on having any more children. They were both ambitious, and having one child is a lot of responsibility. 2 children is 2 times the responsibility, 3 children is 3 times, and so on. The book made the couple sound like they were too driven for children. Martha said later she learned how to be really competitive on Wall Street. She was competitive before. She became really competitive after. It was a tough environment, and Oppenheimer said it made her a brassy and ballsy businesswoman. Martha would assert later that it made her a more organized wife and better mother. In entertaining, she wrote the requisites for writing well about food, to have a good appetite and an apprenticeship as a feeder when you have enough money to pay the check but not enough to produce indifference to the size of the total. She said she had to take her clients to fancy lunches and dinners as part of her Wall Street job, and in those kitchens of those restaurants she learned more about cooking. Martha would claim she was able to cook varied and intricate meals for her family even though she was working all day and taking care of the homes. Others were doubtful, and it sounds almost impossible to do it all at once. In the first movie, Andy encouraged Martha to be a stockbroker, and she ended up making more money than her lawyer husband. Martha told people to invest in Levitt's furniture stock. Andy advised her not to oversell the stock. Martha said she had to sell twice as much as men do and have twice as many clients. Andy said Barron's published an article stating Levitz is implicated in market rigging and brokerage kickbacks. Andy told her the company is getting too close to the companies whose shares they are trading. It was a legal entanglement that could blow up in her face. Her income was what kept her in an apartment in New York. Martha was not happy about moving from New York and into the country. The SEC suspended trading in Levitt stock and investigated allegations that stock promoters issued bullish reports in Levitt stock in exchange for kickbacks. There was a stock in Levitt's Furniture Corporation that went from 6 to 90, then back down again to 6, and all of a sudden they were losing money. The conglomerate was being investigated for securities fraud after allegations surfaced of kickbacks, market rigging, and insider trading. Suddenly, Martha decided living in the country was a good thing. She was still doing well at work, and although she dealt mainly with institutional investors, she did encourage some of her friends to buy into the hot market and acted as their stockbroker. It would be a decision she regretted later. Martha and the firm were promoting stock in Levitt's Furniture. Now, this is from the book. A Florida headquartered company selling schlocky furniture in high volume, and it seemed they were growing rapidly. But they were filling warehouses with furniture, believing it would continue to sell fast, and turns in the economy changed that. Even when it was obvious Levitt's was in dire straits, Andy Moniz, William, and Seidel continued to push the stock. In 1973, Martha talked to Andy about the situation, and Andy warned her not to hype up any of the stocks because she could be held liable. And people ended up losing money. But as people found out later, Martha got out months before. She resigned and decided she would try her fortunes doing something else. Martha was 32 at the time, and the stress of all of it left her a nervous wreck, breaking out in hives. In the documentary, Martha, who is a control freak, felt completely out of control by the dive in the stock market and how she felt losing money for her clients. She couldn't control it, and it drove her crazy. That plummet drained her, and she burnt out on the job. She had an identity crisis, her first one, and she was struggling to know who she was. She was depressed, miserable, and felt useless. She considered selling real estate and got her license, but eventually was against it. Andy switched firms in 1969 with a pay raise to a conglomerate where he handled contracts for international deals and antitrust for corporations, and he found the work more stimulating. Then in 1972, the Stewarts let their friends know that they were moving to Westport, Connecticut. It seemed strange for the couple to move to the suburbs, but Andy said it was because the state had no income tax and they were looking to invest in another piece of property. Andy's company to move to Greenwich, and he was tired of the commute to their Manhattan apartment. In the spring in 1971, they bought an 1805 federal farmhouse at 48 South Turkey Hill Road for $63,000 in the fancy Green Farm section of Westport. Martha looked for fixer-upper homes in the best neighborhoods. That way she could restore them to the spectacle she wanted them to be. She said that house and repairing it into the home she wanted made her the person she is today. She could have never been just Martha Stewart, homemaker. That's who her mother was. Martha was more business-minded. She retreated into Turkey Hill and occupied herself with completing the estate. She saved money by doing projects herself, but people who remember her then said she was manic about it. It didn't seem to bring her happiness, and she often complained of headaches and insomnia. On page 161, Oppenheimer wrote, in order to buy the house and get some renovations started, Andy had to borrow money from his employers, and Martha had to dig into her stockbroker nest egg. The Stewarts did all the restoration work themselves, and it would eventually become the showplace of the Martha Stewart myth. Coincidentally, writer Ira Levin would write a book at the same time called Stepford Wives, about a fictional town in Connecticut very similar to Westport. It's about men who move to this idealistic town where women are turned into robots who have been programmed to please their husbands with gourmet meals, pristine homes, child rearing, and in the bedroom. Westport was the location where the outdoor scenes for the movie were shot. Film critic Pauline Friel said the movie was about the encroaching horror of suburban blandness, suburban women becoming overgroomed deadheads, obsessed with waxed, antiseptic households. This is the criticism Martha would face later on. In the first movie, Martha's father was never accepting of Andy and called their home a crap hole. He blamed their money problems on Andy and asked him if his lawyer friends from rich families also lived that way. Martha turned her obsession into redoing the house, she said, to its future glory. She pointed out Paul Newman lived right down the road. This is when homes like this could be bought by people and weren't bought up by large companies who restore and flip them for profit or for rent revenue. Lexi seemed to have trouble making the transition to her new suburban life. She did well in the city, but so much had changed for her and so fast. It was the move into a home that needed so much work, and there was far less family time together. Overall, she became a much more unhappy child. And Martha wanted the estate to be grander, so they purchased 2 lots for $200,000 more. They installed a black-bottom swimming pool, a livable barn, and other outbuildings, a chicken house, and a huge stone wall. It was a huge job to take on, and for years they did nothing but work on that house. Martha became frustrated and often took her anger out on Andy. She criticized him for not being the powerful businessman she saw at her work. Andy felt like they were living out of the folk tale called The Fisherman and His Wife, a story about an impoverished woman who has an unquenchable drive after her husband catches a magical fish that grants wishes. She keeps wanting more until she wishes to be like God. It's a story about how greed destroys the spirit. Andy said Martha had 2 personalities. There was nice Martha and there was mean Martha. The couple did see a therapist at Andy's urging, but nothing changed between them. Martha thought the therapist was stupid for taking Andy's side. Martha's time at home didn't seem to improve her relationship with Lexi. On page 177, Oppenheimer quoted a friend who said Martha was not one of those warm, nurturing mothers. The same friend believed that stemmed from Martha's own childhood, and she never felt loved as a child. Martha grew up being shut off emotionally. Friends of Martha's were so overwhelmed by her accomplishments that they overlooked her faults and how hard she was on other people, including her own daughter and other people's children. On page 78, Oppenheimer wrote, there was constantly something that had to be done, and she made those little kids do it. Andy expressed love and warmth toward Lexi, but Martha just couldn't do it. Martha was proud of Lexi if she accomplished something, but if Lexi was in pain and needed Martha, she would get angry about it. In the documentary, Alexis remembers moving from the apartment in New York City to her new home a charming farmhouse that needed a lot of work. They painted the house listening to the Watergate hearing on the radio. The neighbors called town hall on Martha for having chickens and ducks in her backyard. And of course, Martha built up her gardens from her roots in New Jersey. In the first movie, her friend Norma Collier, who was burned on Levitt's stock, came back into her life and Martha brought her into her new catering business. Martha learned when she increased the price of her baked goods, people were more willing to buy, assuming that an expensive pie was made better. Westport women were executives and businesswomen, but were still expected to be wives and mothers and hostesses. They didn't have the time, but she could do it for them. Martha found a hole that needed to be filled with the uncatered affair. Martha claimed she just fell into her catering business, and being very driven, it soon became a success. People who worked for her were in awe of her just as her customers were, but co-workers found her critical, judgmental, and very intimidating. She also taught cooking classes and had members meet monthly at her Turkey Hill home. Of course, all this ended up in local newspapers. All this work kept Martha up all hours of the night, if not working, then worrying about work, and she slept very little. Martha was very focused from the beginning, and no one else was competent in her vision. No one was allowed to slow her down, and she wanted to be nationally recognized, and eventually she would get it. The business was booming, but the partnership soon ended. Collier said Martha often criticized her in front of others and took on catering jobs without telling her and keeping the money for herself. When the partnership ended, so did the friendship, and Collier didn't speak to Martha for years. In the first movie, Martha wanted more. Collier was tired and needed a break. While Martha was cooking for her catering business, she told Andy and Alexis to order pizza for dinner. Collier wanted to go to a family reunion. Martha accused her of being a housewife with a hobby. Martha took a catering job of her own and complained to her husband she was doing most of the work. Westport had a common market where upscale items were sold, and there was a small food court that brought in a few $100s a day. As Oppenheimer said on page 189, enter Martha Stewart. She wanted to change the direction of the market to include high-quality, fresh food working women could buy and give to their families. The owners wanted to see what Martha could do, so Martha had a get-together at her Turkey Knob home so they could see what she was selling. Martha had no servants and claimed everything was done by her. She served a fine herb omelet with rolls she said she made herself, but a woman who ate there claimed that they came from another place. Martha seemed perfect, but not very real. She wasn't natural, and her urgency gave other people an uneasy feeling. Regardless, she was at a salary of $250 a week, where she would work for 5 days. Her daily menu would be printed in the local newspaper where women could pick up dinner on the train ride home from work. The common market owners later said Martha ran ads looking for women who wanted to make extra money cooking at home and selling their dishes to her. They were paid as independent contractors, and Martha sold the food in common market at a markup. She was working as a middleman, and she was very clever about it. They also claim Martha hired someone to manage the market basket, something she was supposed to be doing. On page 192, Oppenheimer wrote, as one former close associate of Martha's observed, years later, Martha often got involved with highly creative women whom she could dominate, manipulate, use, and abuse, women who wouldn't fight back. They'd be mistreated and come back for more. They'd have a love-hate relationship with Martha. It was very weird. It can be said these women idolized Martha. At the age of 35, Andy stepped into a very creative universe of publishing. Martha was pleased with this move, not only for the extra money he would make, but also with the hope she could publish a cookbook of her own, as her idol Julia Child did with The Joy of Cooking. There was a market for beautiful coffee books, and one published under Andy, titled Gnomes, of all things, began in the Netherlands and became a bestseller. The book had been written as if gnomes were real, and Andy pitched it as nonfiction. It sold over 1 million copies and licensing agreements for spin off products like gnome towels, book bags, ceramic figurines, date books, posters, sleeping bags, and a video brought in giant profits. Later, Andy would follow Gnome's book with one called Fairies, replicating the same publishing idea. Martha threw a party at the U.S. Customs House in Lower Manhattan, where her crew transformed a room into a magical forest with evergreens, with tiny lights, and young women flitted about dressed as fairies. There were 1,000 guests served omelets filled with caviar, cheese, or vegetables. The president of Crown Publishing Group was very happy with the party, and he told Andy that Martha should do a book. She said she wasn't quite ready, but she would be soon. After a previous injury, Andy received canoeing, caused a mass on his hip. Andy went to have it biopsied and found out it was cancerous. On page 199, Oppenheimer wrote, "On the day of Andy's surgery, Martha shocked co-workers by reporting to work at the market basket. It was almost as if she couldn't comprehend something bad would happen to them, that she could lose him. And once she did realize it, her life was torn apart. Andy began with the 24 radiation treatments, and Martha fell into a depression. It would be 5 years before they knew he was out of the woods. A friend found her sitting in the dark in her bedroom, crying over the fear of losing Andy. There were times when she didn't treat him very well, but she felt she was nothing without him. In some ways, it brought the couple closer together, but it also made Martha want or need to push harder and faster. With her hiring women to cook food in their homes, Martha was circumventing local and state regulations that protected the public with certified government health inspections. Martha had a full working licensed kitchen in her home, but not all the food was prepared there. There were questions about catering events, and profits were supposed to be shared, but Martha did not let the market owners know. Also, in a newspaper article about the market, Martha claimed to be proprietor rather than the manager. Martha said the words were interchangeable. There was a battle of egos, and Martha left. Whether she did it on her own or was fired is up for discussion. Martha's father died on August 31st, 1979, as he waited for double bypass surgery. He had battled a drinking problem and died just 10 days after his 68th birthday. Martha was 38 at the time. She consented for Andy to travel to Russia on business after learning about her father's death, and Frank Costier spoke for all the children at the eulogy. Some of what he said was resentment toward a man who was a-word toward his wife and children, and some people didn't feel that was the right place to do that. Others thought it was okay for him to get it off of his chest. Martha decided to open her own market basket not far from her home and was looking for investors, but she didn't find anyone who would agree to her terms. So she used 5,000 of her and Andy's money to start the business, but she had very few customers and had to close it within a year. Regardless, she was getting publicity for herself in newspapers and women's magazines, and a premiere issue of Country Living sported a layout of Martha and her Turkey Hill farm. It sold successfully with 500,000 copies in just a few weeks. In 1979, there was interest in our society for what the book called a country movement, and Martha sold that lifestyle. Also, Martha believed in her own publicity. In the documentary, she said she realized in those early days she enjoyed homemaking. Andy became president of the ultimate art book publisher in America. Martha would entertain all those art book people in her new country home. She was always throwing parties with delicious food. She decided to start a catering business based off her experience, and everything was homemade. She catered huge parties for places like the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum, Sotheby's, and other private dinners for very rich people like Paul Newman. She did outrageous things to get people's attention. It was food for movie sets, but it was real. It was artistic creations. They said Martha knew how to create pleasure and excitement. She does for other people, but for the ones closest to her, perhaps not so much. On the outside, Martha had this amazing business and a husband with a successful publishing company, a child, and a perfect marriage. Things look fabulous, but are they? Martha said Andy wasn't satisfied at home. She didn't know how many girlfriends he had on the side, but she assumes there were quite a few. Martha warns young women that if you think you're happily married and your husband cheats on you, he's a piece of you know what. Realize he's the problem and get out of the marriage. Although she knew he was cheating, she said she couldn't leave the marriage, or she wouldn't leave. In the documentary, they were two people who seemed to have it all, but they both appeared unhappy in the marriage. Lexi grew up between the unhappiness of her parents and she learned to suppress her emotions. Martha would take her resentment out on her staff. The strictness of her father was passed to Martha, and the people who worked for her felt as abused by her as the children felt abused by their father. The documentary said she had the wrong ideas about what success really was, and she was referred to as a shark who could bite people. To be ruthless as a businessman was acceptable, but not so much in a woman. In the first movie, when Martha decided she can write a book, she sells a romantic story about her life growing up, her marriage, and her child. It sells, but it's not real. She produces a Christmas special show for PBS and had her family acting in it. Martha is depicted as someone behind the scenes who never has any time for her family. She's always working. Andy said she had an obsession with pushing herself. However, she sells this idea of an American family, hearth and home. What tied her book together, or gave it a heart, was Martha's memories of her childhood and growing up in Nutley. Whether those memories were true or stories Martha told to build a myth around her is questionable. Maybe she just chose to remember the good times. In the documentary, after one outrageous party for one of Andy's book clients, another publisher told Martha she should do an entertaining book. Her catering was a beautiful but limited piece of artwork. But with a book, she could capture her artwork forever. Her publisher wanted her to do a cookbook with some black and white photos like the joy of cooking or something like that. But Martha was more than just recipes. It was complete entertaining. It would be a full-color book to learn the art of the celebration. Martha felt she was ready to publish a book, and Annie secured an advance for her on the order of $35,000, a royalty of about 7%, a photography budget, and other benefits usually offered to a published author. On page 232, Oppenheimer wrote Martha would have never become Martha without Andy's help. Her book, Entertaining, would be a cookbook, but more. The food world was beginning to build in America, and people wanted to be exposed to different foods and different kinds of cooking. She said it wasn't too expensive to recreate the entertainment she depicted in her book, but others would say the money, time, and effort to recreate her life was beyond what the majority of women were able to do. Martha said any woman could have what the women living in Greenwich Village could have. It was about bringing beauty to their homes. She said her authenticity was important. She said she was the same person. She cleaned her own house. She raised her own child. She had a husband. She had a garden. And her personal story meant a lot to the reader. She was the first woman who saw the marketability of her personal life. She was the first influencer. She was the whole package. And Martha had one gear forward. Entertaining had an initial press run of 25,000 copies and a cover price of $35, and it would go on to sell far more than that. By 1982, Andy would go on to start his own high-quality illustrated book publishing house, and the book claimed Martha was against him doing that out of fear he would lose a great paying job, and he had to invest $1 million to start his own company. Andy was overseeing Martha's career in publishing, but also helping others sell books who were her competition, like Glorious Foods. The book claimed on page 242 that Martha and Andy were fighting because she wanted him to take a week off to help her plan a party for her book, but he only offered to help out for a few days. Apparently, Andy did what she wanted, and Martha went on a book tour to pitch entertaining. On page 244, Martha appeared on talk shows like Merv Griffin, dressed in Laura Ashley dresses buttoned to her throat. Just like her father, she was a great salesperson, and she knew what her audience wanted to see. There were some complaints as Martha became more popular that recipes in her book were not hers but lifted from others. Yeah, she should have given credit, but people can't own recipes, and they can't sue for some sort of plagiarism even if they wanted to. On page 248, Norma Collier questioned Andy about this, and he said, "Well, you know what, Norma, we checked, and you can't copyright a recipe, and just for insurance, we changed, 4 tablespoons to a quarter of a cup with the measurements and vice versa," as if that made that much of a difference. The food world had some very petty people in it, and Martha was being gossiped about in a bad way over this. Martha told the Chicago Sun-Times that she thought it was because her book sold 120,000 copies. There was a settlement paid by Martha's team for photographs she used in a book that belonged to someone else, but the recipes are public domain. And for all the complaints about republishing recipes, some food critics found an occasional recipe wouldn't turn out right, but Martha brushed it off as someone not following the recipe correctly. Sometimes she had a bad food review, but bad publicity is still publicity, and Martha's book outsold all the others. All this placed a lot of pressure on her, and the book claimed Martha decided to have a hysterectomy at the age of 41 due to PMS issues. She didn't feel at her age that she wanted to have any more children. Martha spent a week in the hospital and still worked from her bed. She was a workaholic. She and Andy had their 20th wedding anniversary, but it seemed the marketing of her book was more important. During the Christmas holidays in 1982, Andy took an expedition to South America while Martha and Lexi stayed at home to have a caviar party for 14 guests. Martha's relationship with Lexi remained strained, as many mother daughter relationships can be, and the book and the documentary reference the movie Mildred Pierce about a housewife who becomes a driven success in the food business and also has an ungrateful and resentful daughter. That's family for you. Lexi may have found camaraderie with her first boyfriend during her junior year of school, since he was also an offspring of a prominent pop artist, Jim Dine. By the time Lexi graduated in June 1983, she graduated in the top 5 in the class of 50. Just like her mother, she attended Barnard just as Martha's second book was released. By the time her 4th book on pies and tarts was released, that book alone sold 270,000 copies. There was just some food writers who didn't like her, but regardless, the public loved her. Martha, just doing an introduction for another book, could place it on the bestsellers list. In the documentary, one reporter on the daytime talk show said she spent 3 hours just looking at the book. And that's pretty much what women did. They bought the book, perhaps tried a few recipes and entertaining ideas, and then kept them out as beautiful coffee table books or put them on shelves in their kitchen. But they couldn't possibly live up to the perfect image of a domestic goddess Martha portrayed in her life. The documentary referred to it as domestic porn. On top of the book deal, her catering business alone was bringing in 7 figures annually. She had a crew of about 30 people working for her, and Martha was very hard to work for. She yelled at people when they messed up things or when something didn't go right. Some of Martha's family members worked for her, and she treated them the same way. It's very hard, impossible even, to deal with someone who's a perfectionist, and Martha was just as hard on herself as she was on others. The town of Westport wasn't making things easier for her. On page 286, Oppenheimer wrote, in late February 1985, Martha and Andy received a summons order to appear in the Bridgeport, Connecticut Superior Court for running an illegal house of catering. Martha had moved her catering business out of her home, but had kitchens set up there for taking photos. The town attorney maintained Martha didn't have required zoning permits to operate a full scale catering business. In court, the Stewarts had to agree to cut gas lines to some of the kitchens and agree to inspections in the future. Regardless, Martha was on TV and she wanted to expand even further. She wanted to produce videos of her entertaining at home, but there was a problem. On page 296, Oppenheimer said Andy and Lexi refused to participate as human props in still another of Martha's commercial ventures. Reality and fantasy seemed to overlap, and this image she was selling wasn't what was happening under their roof. Housewife humorist Irma Bombeck said she saw the show and it knocked her out, but she noticed Martha's world of a Norman Rockwell painting wasn't at all similar to hers. In her world, her husband is parked in front of the TV talking about what happened during a football game. Martha brushed off the comment by explaining it was up to her to be the arbiter of good taste. And there's no celebration more important in a woman's life than her wedding, and Martha was working on an important wedding book. Certainly, it would be a big seller, as her book Entertaining had sold over 300,000 copies, and copies continued to be printed out. The wedding industry was very lucrative, generating billions of dollars annually, and one of the most important chapters in her first book covered at home weddings. While that book was being pulled together, a committee over the corporate planning of Kmart was looking to change the image of the blue collar working class store to something more polished and popular. Kmart had partnered with Jaclyn Smith, former star of Charlie's Angels, to design a highly successful line of clothing called the Jaclyn Smith Collection. It was a financial success for everyone, and Smith was a likable, personable, and photogenic woman who helped Kmart's image. A veteran advertising executive named Barbara Lauren Snyder came across Martha's cookbooks in the library, and although she wasn't a cook herself, she believed the hostess queen would be a good match with Kmart. She met with the Stewarts and they agreed to a $200,000 a year for 5 years straight salary, $3,000 for each in-store visit she made with at least 30 visits a year, and royalties on products sold in all 2,300 Kmart stores. That's a lot of money, particularly in 1987, but it wasn't the $5 million deal each year she would brag about getting later. There would also be a series of TV and magazine ads featuring Martha. The documentary said peddling her high class style to the masses did not go over very well with the social elite, but Martha knew this partnership would bring her a lot of money. It's why so many other fashion designers stick their name on lower end priced items. They convince the masses that they can be part of the elite simply through purchase. The Greenwich Garden Club canceled Martha's appearance because Martha was now attached to something so vulgar, so downscale from them. Although the documentary said Martha believed just because you didn't have money didn't mean you didn't have taste, that's not why women bought her brand at Kmart. They believed because it had Martha's name on it that what they were buying was better than the rest of Kmart products, but that usually wasn't the case. Women simply paid for the Martha brand and label. And although Martha was known and appreciated in certain circles, she exploded into our culture and changed it, both good and bad. At the time, 77 million people per month shopped at Kmart. It was the Walmart of today. Martha told David Letterman on The Tonight Show that people wanted beautiful things and she wanted to give these to the people. Well, David asked, what are they doing in Kmart if they want that? Martha just laughed all the way to the bank. In the documentary, she signed a book, Perfectly Perfect. Everything she did was perfect. In the documentary, it said it ruined her life. She spent all of her time creating her image and not actually living. The reporter noticed she sounded regretful. What's more important, Martha asked, a marriage or a career? You tell me, he said. I don't know, Martha responded. Unfortunately, all this didn't seem to do much to heal a marriage coming apart. Martha was often angry with Andy and told him to leave, but as soon as he agreed and talked about leaving himself, Martha threw a fit and yelled at him for leaving. On page 312, Oppenheimer wrote once again, though he suggested they seek counseling, but this time he told her that if they couldn't resolve their problems, he'd have no other choice but to leave her. Everyone around them knew their marriage was in trouble, and Martha in particular felt resentful because of the idea of splitting money once they separated. Not only does he have a sizable fortune of his own after being together all those years, but he also had ownership over part of what she created. They didn't talk to each other, they confronted each other. And what came out was an admittance by Andy that he had been unfaithful in the marriage. She believed some of the affairs were with women in her inner circle. Martha asked Andy to stay in the marriage and told him that she still loved him, something she rarely admitted to. Andy felt by then it had more to do with the publicity surrounding her upcoming weddings book, and she was more concerned over her career. For the time being, he agreed to distance himself from her and moved into the residence over the barn. The book was published on April 1st, 1987, April Fool's Day, and inside Martha wrote a dedication that said, "To my husband Andy, our wedding will always remain my favorite, and to my daughter Alexis, whose wedding I look forward to with pleasure." She planned on a large book promotional tour and quickly sold out of the 75,000 first copy printing, with the book cost at $50. The launch party for her in New Orleans alone cost $100,000. Martha's marriage difficulties were not disclosed. Andy quietly took up temporary residence at the University Club. Then he moved into a small apartment off Central Park West. On page 318, Oppenheimer quoted Andy talking to a friend saying, "I left her because she became gradually an awful person. She was selfish beyond imagination. She was untruthful, unpleasant, rude, and angry all the time. Martha was never able to look at herself. Every attempt she's ever made to talk to a shrink has been a total failure. With her, it's a contest with a shrink. She won't look inside. She won't look for a minute about why she is the way she is. It's kind of guiltlessness that a wild creature has, that a predator has, because it has nothing in its nature to detect its own cruelty." Martha thought Andy had left during the book promotion on purpose to bring her adverse publicity. Andy said it was just a coincidence and he had reached his breaking point. He said he didn't have a home with Martha. It was a set production for filming. And she still wasn't accepting that he was leaving her. Martha told People that Andy was going through a crisis, like a midlife crisis, and she thought he would come back. By April 27th, 1987, someone leaked this information to the New York Daily News in an article announcing their problems, with Martha denying it in the paper in gossipy fashion, wondering if her next book will be titled Divorces. Andy returned to their home when it was required of him when they were shooting and to stay on Martha and Lexi's good side. Martha tried to be as nice to Andy as she could, but when that was over by September, it was obvious Andy would not be returning to Martha. The documentary said they were two busy people living in different worlds, and when they were together, they were obviously not happy together. Martha was often critical of him, critiquing what he said or what he wore. He handled her business arrangements, and they posed together in photos, but it was more of a business arrangement than a marriage. And if there is any life experience that will cut a person in two, it will be divorce. Martha went through her crazy days when she wanted to know where he was, what he was doing, and who he was seeing. For a woman who always needed to feel in control, something like this felt like it was destroying her. People in her circle were concerned with her mental health and wanted her to seek treatment. Never much of a sleeper, she was staying up all night and felt miserable during the day. She had a projector set up in her home with old photos of Andy when he was younger with past girlfriends, and she would just look at those slides. In March 1988, Andy filed for divorce, claiming the marriage was irretrievably broken. He requested the court grant equitable distribution of the property. Andy thought it would take 6 months to settle divorce, but Martha fought it all the way. She said since Andy left, then everything belonged to her. When she finally accepted the divorce complaint, she had the records sealed. When Andy filed for divorce, he was involved with Robin Whiteley Faircloth, who was 20 years his junior. She was the daughter of a JCPenney executive and a school teacher and had grown up in the affluent Westchester County community of Briar Cliff. She went to school at the University of California and pursued a career as an artist after graduation in Westport. Robin began working for Martha and would often house sit while Martha was on one of her many work trips. She became close to Lexi, who was close in age to her. On page 327, Robin became Martha's regular consultant on flower arranging and styling and was acknowledged for her work in the weddings book. In the documentary, Martha found out Robin lost her apartment and she offered Robin to move her into the barn on the lower 2 acres. It was a little apartment. Martha had to travel for work and Andy would be at home with Robin. They began an affair. This is what Martha believed. Martha said it was like I put out a snack for Andy. Martha confronted Robin about the affair, kicked her out, and no doubt fired her. What the hell are you doing? She asked. Andy betrayed her on their property. Although Martha said the relationship between Andy and Robin was the catalyst for him leaving her, the book said otherwise. Robin continued to work for Martha after Andy's departure, and Robin did flower arranging for a party of Martha's in December 1987, 8 months after Andy left. When Martha found out they were together, Martha refused to pay Robin, but later partially paid her under threat of taking her to court. Martha remained adamant that the affair began while they were still together, but Andy denied it. Martha said she found Robin's sweater one day in Andy's car. She felt betrayed by both of them. Martha accused Andy of adultery multiple times in court papers, and when she realized he and Robin were together, she burst into his office in a rage and threatened him. She claimed Andy was staking his girlfriend on vacations and physically abused her. Andy denied it. The judge signed a stipulation that said neither party is allowed to harass the other. Andy claimed Martha went to his residence without invitation and refused to leave. She physically grabbed him, screamed at him, sent letters to people he knew in which she made derogatory statements, and made phone calls vilifying him. 5 years later, Martha would release a magazine serial called Remembering with a column titled Writing Letters. She saved the letter she wrote to Andy, hoping to understand it all later on. Andy had a trip to Rome for business purposes and he brought Robin with her. A stewardess informed him someone was waiting for him and he stepped off the plane to see Martha holding yet another letter for him to read. When she saw his face, she just shoved the envelope through the ramp opening, then turned and walked away. She always claimed each letter would be the last, but there was always another one in waiting. Robin's car was also keyed, and a letter was sent to her parents containing remarks about their daughter. Martha denied it was her. Martha found Robin out jogging and told her if she ever saw her out again, she would run her over. On page 332, Oppenheimer wrote, "For a long time, Robin was afraid of Martha. She thought the older woman was stalking her and may have spotted her outside her Westport studio apartment in Martha's Suburban, staring out her window with the interior lights on. A friend of Annie said Martha destroyed any affection Annie once felt for Martha. Martha said some people revel in self-pity, but it was hard for her to talk about it. What she couldn't say in person, she could say in letters. And as the letters were written by her, it became obvious she felt more and more desperate to keep her marriage, really her life, together." Dear Standy, I cannot sleep. I cannot eat. My skin is worried, and many lines that were not there are now there. I am agonizingly jealous of your other women. I can't bear that you use what we did together on others. Dear Andy, I'm in a really fragile, breakable state right now. I really feel physically ill because of all of this, as if my brain were not able to break. Dear Andy, maybe you are planning to marry her and keep her with my money, so she can paint herself in portraits in the nude. It is very titillating, isn't it? Maybe she will paint you in the nude also. I love to see that painting. I am very concerned about my privacy and my professional life. I'm telling everyone that you are away for a while. That is all. Dear Andy, I understand your craving for specs, with others. No one would care about you like I do. No one will ever love you as much. Give me another chance, Andy. I'm so sorry about so much. Why does it have to be too late? Dear Andy, again I feel betrayed and all alone. When you tell me this is no longer your home, after all we did here together, why shouldn't I say I'm going to burn it down? I have to go to San Francisco and talk about weddings and my wonderful life. I hope you are enjoying your freedom. And I hope my plane crashes. I am sitting on a plane right now, crying, coughing, feverish, and so miserable. I cannot believe myself. I should be vital, beautiful, smexual, and desirable. And here I am, a total wreck. I am 45 years old, worried and lonely, alone, hopeless. The future is a total blur. In the documentary, she said they've been married for 27 years. Martha is clear that he wanted the divorce, not her. She said he was throwing her away. She said in the documentary she was 40, but she was closer to 45 by then, and gorgeous. She said she was a desirous woman, but he was treating her like a castaway. She said he treated her badly. He left the marriage for someone else. Martha didn't leave the marriage for someone else. She saw herself as a monogamous swan. She forgot about the affair she had, but she would have remained in the marriage even if she wasn't happy. That was her definition of monogamy. She thought it was an admirable trait. In the documentary, she asked to move on to a happier subject after talking about the divorce. In the first movie, Annie said he wasn't having an affair, but it seemed too convenient for him to date and later marry a woman who just happened to be hanging around the house as their marriage fell apart. She was also a woman 20 years his junior, and they would go on to have children together. Martha called Robin a smut and told her she was telling her parents what she did. After all Martha did for her and for him. You don't get it, she yelled at him. It's my money. And you're always leaving. Andy told her she would never be happy because no one and nothing will ever be good enough for her. The more she has, the more she needs. She didn't even notice what she had around her because she's so obsessed with getting the next thing. And he said, I loved you, Martha. Our marriage was never perfect. Sometimes messy. Sometimes it was great. Sometimes it was two people just trying to share their lives together. It was never good enough for you. But then I guess the truth is never good enough. Not for Martha Stewart. Martha attended the 25th reunion at Bernard class of 63. She was really the class of 64, but considered herself in the 63 class, so Martha got what she wanted. Classmates recalled Martha said everything she had planned for her life turned upside down when her husband left her. She was very vulnerable and very sad. They battled over homes and land and pieces of art. There were homes on Turkey Hill with 2 additional lots, the Adams House in Westport, the Middlefield House, land in Salem, New York, a $600,000 fifth-floor apartment just decorated near Central Park, and a 5,000-acre country manor in Virginia. Plus, there was property in East Hampton she would eventually retreat to as an escape from her divorce. That place cost 1.6 million plus another million in renovations. Not satisfied with one house there, she bought a second for 3 million sight unseen. The New Yorker ran a cartoon on Martha titled Martha Stewart Takes Over the Universe. Martha had some battles with the property police similar to HOA managers over the renovations of her property, and writer Kurt Vonnegut was her entree into Hampton society since you could only join by invitation. In the loss of her marriage, she throws herself into the business. She obviously kept her home and maintains her property. He made it clear that he didn't feel comfortable there anyways. There's a video of her in 1988 where she's getting ready and she wants her hair done a certain way and she's waiting to smile for her audience, and it's obviously so fake. She's not happy. She waited until the filming starts to plaster a smile on her face. It's symbolic of the marriage she had. It never occurred to her that she could be a woman on her own and she could make it without a man. It just wasn't done for women in her generation. Her image was of a domestic goddess, a happy wife, mother, and homemaker. It's as the documentary said, Martha does not have failure, and that's how she saw the divorce. It was something beyond her control. That she saw the marriage as a failure with all they accomplished together was very sad. What would all the women, her fans and supporters, think when they realized perfectly perfect Martha couldn't keep her marriage together? Well, they didn't care. Divorce was on the rise, and plenty of other women were facing the same challenges in life. The majority of divorces now are started by women, but then women were homemakers who were married to prosperous men who had office affairs with colleagues, secretaries, assistants, or what have you, then left their wives in the dust for these younger women. The documentary said women still admired her because they wanted to make cakes, but that's obviously not why her audience didn't abandon her. They admired the fact that she could and did make it on her own. They wanted to make it just like she did. What Martha may have represented for so many women was a way of transforming herself into an entrepreneur and taking what she knew and enjoyed and making a living from it. Particularly from domestic fields, these women had been performing for years. They hoped to emulate her. They found her both inspirational and aspirational. Living well is the greatest revenge, and maybe they too could become a success, just like Martha Stewart. Martha said how grateful she was that she wasn't just some miserable housewife, particularly when her marriage ended, that she had her own business and ideas for her future. As for Martha, she wasn't going to drown her sorrow over a divorce in a pint of ice cream or go into therapy to understand what went wrong in her relationship. That's just not her. Instead, she threw herself into her work to make sure her success overshadowed his. She was successful before. Afterwards, she became a legend. In 1990, her gardening book had a first press run of 250,000 copies and grossed 12.5 million, giving Martha about 1.5 million in royalties. By then, all of her books total has sold 2 million copies and grossed more than $70 million. In 1990, her gardening book had a first press run of 250,000 copies and grossed 12.5 million, making Martha about 1.5 million in royalties. By then, all of her books total had sold 2 million copies and grossed more than $70 million. On page 345, Oppenheimer wrote, by the early 90s, Martha had a personal income of about $2 million. She was by then the product she actually sold. And although the documentary wanted to show Martha as being very down to earth and very practical, what she actually sold was expensive affluence. Some people on her management team claimed at the time they brought up concerns that average people could not afford to poach a fish for $150, with the fish alone costing $100. But Martha said she wanted to give people something special, something beautiful and unique. Martha had herb gardens at her disposal, commercial ovens, plenty of help, and time to cut heart shapes out of bread and cucumber sandwiches. Sadly, the breakup between herself and her brother Frank happened when he claimed he wanted to get into her business and sell items like aprons with tags that said, "Look who's cooking with Martha." When she refused, he sold stories about her to the tabloids. Martha never really cared for the marketing idea of placing her name on cheaper items. As Oppenheimer said on page 353, Martha liked the Kmart money. Martha did not like Kmart. There were complaints that Jacqueline Smith was very nice and sweet to people. Martha was not. Kmart was not making the money they thought they would from teaming up with Martha. In 3 years of their 5-year contract, Kmart had spent $27.9 million total for marketing, production costs, and royalties. But in 1989, the sales had totaled only $12.9 million. Regardless, the remaining 2 years was extended, and Kmart was looking to test a direct mail Martha Stewart Kmart catalog. Martha's 10th book, published in 1992, and her 5th how to video was to feature the decorating showcase of the historic teal and white Adams House, with the beneficiary of the event being Paul Newman's Hole in the Wall Gang Camp Fund, a charity for children with life threatening illnesses. 300 people paid $15 each for the opening. Then Martha put a for sale sign on the front lawn asking for $1.35 million for the property, twice as much as she paid for it. The 80-something great-granddaughter of Ebenezer Adams owned the house and had no interest in restoring the property. Martha always looked for places like this she could restore and make a profit off of. The home was filled with antiques and collectibles. Martha decided the renovations alone would cost $1 million, but she could sell the tape covering the renovations through Kmart. Kmart vendors paid to run a 30-second TV ad, and that generated approximately $14 million. From that amount, they were able to pay Martha. The magazine Family Circle also ran 8-page Martha Stewart inserts. Martha brokered this deal in 1987 when she and Andy were still together. The renovations were completed in 1990, but there were concerns from Westport Planning and Zoning Commission that Martha was personally benefiting from the fundraiser tied to the company. Martha claimed that between 1982 and 1990, she had donated a whopping $10 million to charity, but others said they wouldn't be surprised if she had the very first dollar she ever made. A press release was given by Martha stating in excess of $210,000 net after expenses was given to the Paul Newman charity. The initial attempts to sell the Adams house failed, and the property was an arguing point in Martha's divorce to Andy. In April 1993, she finally sold the house for $863,500 and made a profit of $327,500. The Stewarts' divorce was finalized in the summer of 1990, formally ending a marriage of 29 years. Martha kept all the contents of the Turkey Hill estate, valued at $900,000, cash and securities. She also kept the Connecticut house her mother lived in. Andy received the acreage in upstate New York, and he got the Middlefield cottage. Martha also had to pay him $1.5 million for his share of Turkey Hill, which she took her good old sweet time doing. Andy threatened foreclosure on the property, and Martha agreed to meet him to give him a check. He went to the house to pick it up, but found out Martha had deducted several $100,000 for money she wanted to give to Lexi. Lexi was not talking to her father, no doubt over the divorce and the younger woman he was with, and he said if Lexi wanted money from him, she could start talking to him. Martha agreed finally to give him the whole amount, and Andy told her to give him a certified check rather than a personal one. In October 1996, Andy brought a civil suit against Martha for $150,000 owed to him in a pension fund. Martha had remained very angry and broken over the divorce. So had Lexi, and Martha paid for her to go into therapy. On page 368, Oppenheimer wrote, as late as the spring of 1996, Martha said, I feel rejected, stupid, and failed. I should have gotten on with my life. Somebody told me that, and I didn't listen. I should have. Andy admitted later that neither he nor his ex wife did a good job of parenting. They were too involved in their personal lives and renovating homes. They didn't spend enough time with Lexi growing up. Lexi did not invite her father to her college graduation, and financially, Martha was the one taking care of Lexi. She financed a Bridgehampton motel for her. Eventually, Lexi wanted out of the motel business and put it up for sale for $1 million. She also opened up a gym and an East Hampton shop. Although the relationship between mother and daughter remained rocky, even with the financial footing, people believe Martha really didn't want Lexi to have a relationship with her father. Basically, she was a pawn in her parents' marital war. The divorce seemed to affect Lexi's relationship with men, and she reported to police in late 1996 that an ex boyfriend hit her in the face. Martha had a huge birthday party, and anyone who was anyone was in attendance. She was networking and other people in entertainment and business, and she had plenty of romances. Martha was no slummer in the dating department. She only attached herself to wealthy, intelligent men who maybe were seen as socially awkward. The documentary said they were weirdos. Whatever floats your boat. Martha was devastated by Annie's departure, but that didn't mean she wasn't looking for the next Mr. Right. She had a glow up with plunging necklines and a new hairstyle. She went from looking wholesome to looking like a hot woman. On page 376, Oppenheimer wrote she loved to be tall and looked powerful, and she felt that she was, smexy. She would wear this ankle length mink coat that she looked monstrously striking in. Her new photos had her in 4-inch heels, bare shoulders, and having a come hither look on her face. She watched her diet more and worked out regularly with a female trainer. Martha pursued her one-time colleague Brian Dennehy, once a colleague from Wall Street, but by then was in acting. She always thought he was an attractive man. They hung out together, but the relationship wasn't that serious. Still, she was able to reach into her past and grab someone from a time when she was much younger, and that must have made her feel very desirable. While still separated, Martha found a brief yet passionate romance with art dealer Richard Fine. Then she dated a wealthy businessman, Dan Hendrick, who was in his 40s and recently divorced. They met at a Christmas party on Park Avenue. He found Martha to be a really fun gal. Sometimes she was linked to conservative talk show host John McLaughlin, who escorted her to some major events. There was also Robert Morton, an executive producer for Late Night with David Letterman, who was 10 years her junior and a known ladies' man. There was also Dr. Sam Waxel, who was initially linked to Martha, but he would go on to date Lexi, who was 15 years his junior. The book said it was perhaps her relationship with Hedrick that lasted the longest. They had much in common, but in the end, he felt like she had an unrequited appetite for business that he could not contend with. In the documentary, she had a more serious relationship with Charles, who created Word and Excel at Microsoft. Martha called him a genius, and they spent a lot of time together. She said she wasn't looking for a husband, but she wanted to keep moving and thinking and doing in her life and business. The reporter in the documentary asked her if she was ever in a relationship where she felt comfortable talking about her feelings to him. She said no, and she thought that was why she hadn't had many personal relationships. She wants to know what someone is doing or maybe what they were thinking about. She likes being around people who are always doing something. Martha was only allowed to publish one book a year through her publishing company, but she said she had so much more to say, and why not start a magazine? There were certainly other women's magazines out there, but she believed her brand was different. Obviously, she went to Condé Nast first, since they sell an upper class lifestyle, but they would not let her call her magazine Martha Stewart Living because they wanted to protect their brand name over hers. So she went to Rupert Murdoch, and he said they were closing magazines, and he recommended Time magazine. Time magazine, like many magazines, were run by men, and they could not get their minds around this woman selling a lifestyle over and over again to the public. Martha told them that living is limitless, and they said, well, if you really mean that, then maybe this is a good idea. Time Warner had never backed anything that had someone's face on the cover. What happened if that person tarnished her reputation? Imagine O.J. Simpson as the spokesperson for Sports Illustrated. They were not blind to the risk and knew Martha did not have a squeaky clean background with an ugly divorce and a child who was barely on speaking terms with her. In the end, they decided that the public didn't care about those things. Finally, a contract was hammered out that gave Martha a starting salary of $450,000 a year. With expected bonuses, she could receive an additional $500,000 in compensation. Plus, she had perks like a chauffeur-driven car, clothing allowance, hair and makeup, and enough to cover business expenses working out of her home. Later, she received a loan from Time for an East Hampton home instead of additional stake in her operation. Martha was offered a phantom equity, meaning in 5 to 9 years' time, they would have a third party appraise the gross value of the business, and Martha would receive 15% of that valuation. On November 12, 1990, the first 500,000 copies of Martha Stewart Living appeared on newsstands. It sold at $3 per magazine, and only about one-fifth did not sell. The second issue sold better than the first, with just a few negative press comments. On page 396, Oppenheimer quoted the Wall Street Journal, although it purports to be a practical guide to a stylish home. Martha Stewart Living portrays a fantasy world where women have time to play croquet, kids are clean, and checks don't bounce. It was considered a very white magazine with white people running around in the pages. Time also signed a 10-page contract with Martha on June 17, 1991, to produce TV programming. Videos and books derived mainly from the magazine. The magazine planned to go bi-monthly in 1992. Martha was everywhere, and there was some concern of overexposure, of saturation in the media with too much about Martha. Yet the American audience remained fascinated by her no matter how crazy the project she crafted became. Even if they couldn't do what she did, they could live vicariously through her. She hoped her show would air on NBC, but it was picked up by cable's Lifetime network. Magazine sales tripled in 2 years to 750,000, and advertisers were lining up. Eventually, Martha brought back her name and magazine from Time. Kmart gave her a loan against her sales for $85 million at a time when she had $2 million to spend. To quote Martha, it was a very good thing. Kmart didn't have a choice. It was risky giving her a loan on what may potentially sell in the future, but they didn't want to lose their partnership with her, and it's how the stock market operates every day. Now Martha completely owned her business. Her synergy was Martha Incorporated. This company was omni-media in scope, meaning there was an integration of all media types into one single cohesive, interactive digital platform. She called it Synergy, and not many businesses were willing to expand into every form of sales and entertainment. And the idea of this synergy is the sum of many will come together to create a greater effect than what any of these individually would have done on their own. All of her work were like planets in a solar system, and at the center of the universe was Martha Stewart, the sun. It was all about her. Martha Stewart Home Enterprises brought in something like $200 million a year. She said no one had done that before, but there were other celebrities who would say differently. However, no other woman was able to do it before Martha, and she was everywhere. Her next move was to take her company public. She said it was the American dream, her American dream anyways. And as Martha grew bigger, so did the whispers around her that Martha was not the happy homemaker other people had to deal with. Apparently, the lower people were to her, the less they liked her. These rumors found their way into the press right before her company would go public. What's obvious is when a company is built off the image of one person, the investors were frightened what happens when the image of this one person gets destroyed. Their brand would go with her. Her brand was based on Martha's reputation and her credibility. They were concerned these rumors would tarnish her image. What if in real life, perfectly perfect Martha, who was perfect in every way, wasn't as perfect as people think? They roasted her on Saturday Night Live with an actress saying she was spending so much time knitting doilies and that's why her husband left her. The documentary questions the haters of Martha at the time. Maybe it was because no one could do what Martha does as well as Martha does. Oprah asked on her show who has the time to do things Martha does. A guest critical of Martha said the standards Martha set makes other women who don't have the time to replicate her life feel like they are failures. And Martha said women may not be able to make the cake they see in her books, but they can buy the books and dream about achieving it someday. And anyone who worked for her were made to feel like they were failures. Few could satisfy Martha's need for perfection. The documentary said she only slept for 4 hours a night, which is inhuman. If Martha were a man, then her actions would be applauded. But even then, they may not be the case. And men found it hard to accept that this homemaking expert could also be a biatch when she wanted to. Homemakers are supposed to be easy, sweet, kind, generous, motherly, helpful, submissive. That wasn't Martha. She wanted it to look casual, but she wanted to achieve perfection, and those words don't belong in the same sentence. The fact she brought her business to Wall Street shows how driven and dedicated she was to her work. She believed in herself. She wanted others to believe in her too. There was an initial public offering of 7.2 million shares of Class A stock for the price of $18, which rose to a high of $49.50 before hitting $35.62 at the closing bell. Overnight, Martha Stewart became a billionaire, the first self-made American woman billionaire. Everything Martha touched, it seemed, turned to gold. She, like few other women in the business world, had the Midas touch. You couldn't lose, everyone assumed, putting your moolah on Martha. She joined the New York Stock Exchange Board. She was also on the board of Revlon. Other people could now see her vision. In the documentary, Joan Didion wrote an article about Martha titled Everywoman.com, Getting Out of the House with Martha Stewart, which Martha absolutely loved. Didion wrote, Martha had critics who wanted to expose her for being a fraud. She didn't seem to be satisfied no matter how much she achieved. Men who made their fortunes in real estate or technology want to minimize her achievements in the homemaking world. The success of Martha is not seeing her as a homemaker, but understanding she took a homemaking business and built it up to the point she could take it to Wall Street. The article claims Martha's story belonged in the same category of women who struggled all through history to make it, and some fictional characters who, through determination, ruggedness, and perseverance, were able to make it with what is considered unskilled women's work. It is not about female domesticity, but female empowerment, which is somewhat correct. Don't forget about the marriage to a well-connected man. Regardless, what is the point of pursuing success when it doesn't seem to bring happiness? Martha brought a friend with her named Mariana Pasternak on a vacation to Cabo, Mexico. They stopped in Texas to fuel the private plane, and Martha called her office. Her assistant let her know her stockbroker called her about ImClone. It was a biotech company started by a friend of Martha's named Sam Waxel. A drug called Erbitux was created to treat several diseases. Martha called Peter Bekanovic her stockbroker, and Martha said he told her the stock was going down and he advised to sell, and she said go ahead and sell. Then she enjoyed her vacation in Cabo. 6 months later, her world would fall apart. In the documentary, the FBI arrested Sam Waxel for insider trading. Waxel found out 2 days before public knowledge that this wonder drug would not be approved by the FDA, and he tipped two family members about the drug, which would lower the stock, but everyone else who didn't know this and had stock would lose money. It's the idea that these small group of rich people didn't have to follow laws others had to follow. They get out before losing millions while others face financial ruin. The government set up a task force to investigate white-collar crime, with the public demanding these fraudsters to face some sort of justice. This was after Enron and World.com fleeced the public out of billions of dollars. They were able to follow the money with people unloading ImClone stock in advance of the announcement of the wonder drug not being approved. Martha Stewart was one of the investors who simultaneously dumped her stock with a select few. The U.S. Attorney called Martha's lawyers to have her answer questions about her stock dumping. She went downtown with her lawyers to answer the questions. Her lawyers told her to repeat, "I do not remember, I do not recall." Martha said she didn't think she did anything wrong, and her lawyer said she didn't do anything wrong. The probe focused on Martha's December 27, 2001, sale of 3,928 shares of stock. On page 11 in the book, Martha was facing a 9-count indictment specifically charging her with lying to investigators, claiming she and her stockbroker, Peter Bekanovic, formerly of Merrill Lynch and Company, who also claimed he was innocent, had an agreement to sell her ImClone stock if it fell under 60. The indictment also accused Martha of altering a telephone message from the broker in her assistant's computer. Martha was also socked with security fraud charges for allegedly misleading investors about her ImClone sales to bolster prices of shares in her own company. Bakanovic's assistant, Douglas Fanuel, assisted the case after he pled guilty to a misdemeanor in the fall of 2002. Later, Waxel pled guilty to a series of charges relating to the sale of stock by himself and his family members. On June 10th, he was sentenced to 87 months in prison in order to pay $4.3 million in fines and restitution for his role in the scandal that ensnared Martha. When Martha learned that Waxel and his daughter were dumping their shares, investigators have asserted Martha did it likewise, making at least $45,000 more than if she had sold just a few days later. If convicted, Martha would face up to 5 years in prison for each charge, up to 10 years on one count of securities fraud, along with a 7-figure fine. Martha was said to have been offered a deal by the prosecutors, lesser charges, but a plea bargain that included prison time. Martha said no, she would not go to jail, and vowed to prove her innocence before a jury of her peers, which might prove difficult, as the book stated, because Martha, high on her pedestal, seemed peerless. She was released without posting bail, but she was told she would be arrested if she skipped any court appearances. She had to let the U.S. Attorney Office know 72 hours in advance if she left the country for vacations or shopping trips. She gave up being CEO of her company but planned to remain as director and chief creative officer. "I want you to know that I am innocent and that I will fight to clear my name," Martha claimed. She started up a site to post her updates on the case, and by mid-June, the site had 6 million hits and received 40,000 emails expressing support and encouragement. It did not keep her business from failing. Within days, her stock fell to $10 and change. On June 9th, she entered the FBI headquarters where she was photographed and fingerprinted. Martha received support by a famous woman named Hillary Rodham Clinton, who was a junior U.S. Senator at the time and was also selling her book, Living History. She called Martha, a friend, and said she thought there was more than meets the eye to this case. Jay Leno joked that Martha was losing so much money that she may actually have to start buying stuff at Kmart. It's what happens when a company is built on the image of one person. When the image is tarnished, then the company suffers too. David Letterman joked what a beautiful day it is. It's so beautiful that Martha Stewart was doing her insider trading outside. Martha finally addressed the public in a written statement claiming she had no improper information and the transaction was entirely lawful. She went on the Today Show, as she's done before, to do her Martha Stewart Living segment, and Martha told the host she was ready to make her salad, and the host says, "Well, but first let me ask you a few questions about what was happening." Martha said she released a statement that she was not involved in any insider trading, but she hadn't publicly commented on the case. As the host asked, "What do you say about the allegations?" Martha took a long breath, like an animal puffing herself up, and she said, "Well, you understand I'm involved in an investigation, that it has serious implications, and many people are involved in this whole investigation, and I'm just not at liberty to say at this time or to make any comments whatsoever. I certainly hope that the matter is resolved in the very near future." The host continued to question her, and Martha looked at her, then back down at the knife in her hand as she is chopping vegetables. I have to say that host was very brave. Finally, Martha cuts her off and says, "I have nothing more to say. I'm really not at liberty to say anything. And as I said, I think this will be resolved all in the very near future, and I will be exonerated of any ridiculousness." The host continued, "I know your image is very important to you and everything you've created over the years. In the midst of this, the stock prices of the company has dropped and the media host trailed off. All the while, Martha keeps moving her knife and chopping cabbage, and the host looked down at her knife like she better be careful with her questions." And then the host continued, "The frenzy that has surrounded the last week or so, how has it been for you to be in the middle of all that?" Finally, Martha looked at her and lifted her knife and said, "I want to focus on my salad." Of course, the press covered Martha chopping cabbage and refusing to answer any questions. The story was fed through the media with photos of her and Sam Waxel posing together at events. The tabloid coverage was negative, and Martha's supporters said they wanted to tear her down after building her up to the level she was. The documentary claimed Martha traded before speaking to Sam. Sam remained loyal to Martha and said he could have gotten out of trouble by implicating Martha, but he wouldn't do it. Jim Comey, President Trump fired from the FBI, was the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He brought charges along with civil charges by the FCC against Martha and her broker, Bokanovic. They were not charged with insider trading because neither Martha or her broker spoke directly to Waxel. It wasn't possible to bring direct insider trading charges against them. But it's believed Martha received information that Waxel and his family members were selling their stock, so she knew to sell hers. Someone by proxy must have told her, so she sold. Then she lied to the FBI about it, and that's how they got her, for obstruction of justice. The documentary claimed Comey was ambitious and wanted to make a name for himself, and that's why he brought the case against Martha. In no time, the stock fell by 86%, and the press was willing to skewer Martha like some recipe from her cookbook. They went after Martha personally rather than the company, but Martha is her company, or at least the image she sold to the world. "Why do people want to hate Martha?" a reporter asked. A woman replied, "You always want to see Little Miss Perfect fail." Barbara Walters asked Martha in an interview, "Why do people want to hate you?" In the documentary, she breathed deeply but didn't answer. Martha, who was so perfect and organized and efficient in everything in her life, just didn't sound truthful when she claimed she couldn't remember anything. There were attempts to plead the case out, but Martha didn't want to admit that she lied. She didn't want to go to court and admit she lied to the government. Martha absolutely claimed not that she was innocent, but she didn't believe she did anything wrong, and there's a difference. In the documentary, Peter Bogdanovic's secretary, Douglas Fanfil, said he was instructed by Bogdanovic to tell Martha about the stock sale. He said he gave the tip to Martha. On top of that, Martha treated the 28-year-old like garbage, and that's how she treated all underlings. He said he had never been treated more rudely by any stranger on the phone. She told him about layoffs at his office in anger and hung up on him. The press were getting a view of Martha as a bully that the public had no idea about. She was seen as a villain, petty, mean, and a really bad person. Although it shouldn't matter in her court case, her real personality turned a lot of people against her. Ms. Magazine Elaine Lafferty said Martha was being criticized for being a rich, loud, and not so nice woman, but overall because she was a woman. Men don't like it when women are biatches, you know. The press was unrelenting and negative. As the case against Martha continued, Martha's best friend, Marianne, would also testify against her. Marianne was there and overheard what happened. Pasternak testified Martha told her about the stock sales. Isn't it nice to have brokers who tell you about those things? Martha stared at her former friend with cold, icy eyes. Martha said Marianne was frightened, but the government told her what to say, but it doesn't sound like that. It sounds like Marianne was telling the truth. The documentary points out that the amount she saved by selling her stock was about $45,000, and a small sum compared to her wealth. Why would she risk her entire empire in order to save such a small amount? To understand the answer is to understand people like Martha. People like her always have to win, and winners are always perfect. To lose money, even the small amount for her, would still be losing, and Martha didn't lose, ever. It would be a dent in her armor, a weed in her perfect garden. So she sold the stock and was caught, and she ended up losing far more than she would have if she'd just been able to let go. When the jury came in and found her guilty, Alexis fainted at the thought her mother would be sent to prison. Martha was now a convicted felon. Stock for her company plummeted. Her TV show was canceled. Advertisers left her magazine. She resigned from her company and tried to distance herself from it in an attempt to save it. But when the company is named after you and it's about the life you lead and sell to the public, how can you possibly remove yourself from it? She stepped down as CEO because she was now a felon, and someone can't have a criminal record and be in charge of a publicly traded company. Alexa said Martha felt like her life was wasted. Something she found to be so trivial ruined everything she built. The reporter asked her how she was doing, and it's obvious she looked very lost and out of sorts. Then she breathed heavily and tried to smile for the camera. There were rumors that it took a toll on Martha. She was drinking the same way her father did when he was under stress, and she gained weight. She continued to talk about holiday meals she was preparing before she would have to face sentencing. She was preparing herself for something she feared she may not be able to face. She received 5 months in prison, 5 months of home detention, 2 years of probation, and a fine of $30,000. In the documentary, she went to Alderson, West Virginia, the prison town, to do her time. At that time, they called it Camp Cupcake because it was supposed to be an easy place to serve. Martha would say otherwise. There was no guarantee that 63-year-old Martha would not be harassed during her stay. They could not offer her private security. She entered at 5:55 a.m. and was allowed to wear her pearl earrings. Her contacts were not allowed. She was stripped and body searched. She didn't like her bed or the bed springs and wanted the top bed, but because she was 63, she had to sleep on the bottom. They woke up at 4 a.m., showered at 5 a.m., watched TV at 6, and had coffee, what they served as coffee, at 7. She also said the milk was terrible. She said the food was very poor quality and there was no fresh anything. It was all starches and carbs and fats. They could watch TV in a library of sorts. On day 6, Martha walked by two well-dressed women and remarked on how nice the morning is and how nice they looked. It wasn't until she got closer that she realized they were guards with key rings hanging on their sides. Her hand happened to brush one of the chains, but she didn't think anything about it. She was called in after for touching the guard. Martha apologized and thought the incident was minor. She was dragged to solitary for touching the officer. She had no water or food all day. And this, Martha said, was Camp Cupcake. Imagine how bad other ones are. Alexis went to visit Martha every weekend. Some friends went to visit, and her brother said some other inmates wanted to hurt Martha. She was afraid of being jumped. Martha wrote to her boyfriend Charles Simony and asked him how he was doing. He visited her only once in 5 months and hardly wrote to her or emailed her. Martha said he didn't like hanging out with someone in jail. It's obvious how bad this hurt her. She tried not to show it on her face, but it was there. The pain and betrayal she felt. Apparently he was hanging out on his yacht. Martha felt disassociated and lonely, solitary. Solitary is not such a bad thing. There was silence at night, and the moon was in the sky. She said she felt very inconsequential. Again, which is not such a bad thing to feel. Maybe for the first time ever, Martha has no other choice but to feel. She fears no one would miss her if she didn't return to reality. She said she had to fight to keep her self-esteem from withering away, and she felt like she had to fight her way out of a hole, something she had to fight her way out of her whole life. In the second film, the prison has an annual Christmas decorating game, and each team gets $25 to decorate and can win $100 apiece for the Peace on Earth theme. The women in her block expected Martha to be the leader, but she doesn't want to join. She knew they would win with Martha on their team. She finally relents. She had them make origami cranes and hang them from the ceiling. They win second place. First place didn't look so good. My dog could have done better, one woman complained. They decided the reason they lost was because Martha was on their team and they would not reward her. Nearly 4 weeks in, and some Muslim women asked her to meet them in a chapel where they had 5 guest speakers who would advise women on how to better themselves and improve their situation. Martha encouraged these women to be entrepreneurial if they had a good, unique, and clear idea, something that would help others, something that many needed or wanted. The same things she had been saying for many years. Follow hot trends, be authentic, and have a unique idea. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. If I can do it, Martha said, you can too. She felt the women took something from her lecture that would improve their lives. She helped with some business plans. She said she enjoyed hearing the hopes and dreams of these women. One woman who served time with her said Martha was bossy at first, but she realized they were all in this boat together. The prison had greenhouses, but they were not using them. One long-serving inmate had tried to grow a garden outside, but she had no resources. Martha gave her some of her gardening books and said she was grateful. Martha said prison does nothing to reform, to rehabilitate, to re-educate, to make people feel better, or to induce people to go on to better things. Martha worked with her to build a garden at the prison. Another inmate named Sister Carol Gilbert was surprised by Martha's offer to dinner consisting of cucumber sandwiches. The sister never heard of them before, so Martha showed them how to make them. Another woman named Susan Spry said Martha was very congenial and wanted to be part of everyone's life. Above all else, Martha was able to be productive, and these women came together to help one another through a very difficult time. Martha wished them a better life for themselves and their children and their families. Above all else, Martha was preparing to return to her life as spring began, and of course she had many plans. She boarded a private plane belonging to her boyfriend and wearing a crochet cape one of the women made for her. She said the women have many talents and were natural craftspeople. Martha said it looked great on her leaving the prison, and she was very happy to be out of there. Martha met with the employees of her Omni Media company. She thanked them and she cried. She returned to her TV show, but Mark Burnett, the creator of The Apprentice, wanted to change it to The Martha Show as a talk show with a variety of celebrity guests, which was different from the show she had. Martha wanted to return as a teacher of fine living, but she was vulnerable at that moment and let other people change the show. She lost control of her show, of her brand name, and what it stood for. It felt forced and very fake. She lost her authenticity. The show became very gimmicky. And times were changing. Other shows similar to Martha, like Rachel Ray, popped up, but Rachel's recipes were easier to follow, not so tedious with expensive ingredients, and fit the lives of younger people who wanted simple recipes that they could look up on their iPhone. The new Kmart deals were a fraction of what they were, and money was not coming in like it used to. She found it harder and harder to make money. Her social relevance declined, and her stock dropped to $2.50 a share. Her relationship with Charles also suffered. They had this trip planned to Iceland, and one night in bed he announced to her that he wanted to get married to someone else. Her name is Lisa. Martha asked, "Lisa who?" There was no warning. They had been together for 15 years. And by the way, Lisa's parents said they did not want him to continue any communication with Martha, so it was goodbye for good. Amazing this billionaire couldn't control his own life. Martha thought his treatment of her was horrible. He just threw her away, just like her ex-husband. Martha called it her second divorce. In the end, she sold her company for $363 million, and it marked the end of an era for Martha Stewart. The company will be sold for parts. Martha said she personally lost more than $1 billion. Some believe Martha's company would have been worth tens of billions of dollars were it not for the conviction. Well, that's maybe. She lost a lot of her will after that. She is older, and she doesn't have the drive she once had. She said she lives by two mottos: learn something every day, and the other, when you are through changing, then you are through. And as it turned out, she wasn't done yet. In 2015, Martha Stewart was at the Comedy Central roast of Justin Bieber. He was going through a lot personally in his life and making some bad decisions. His management hoped the roast would get Justin's career back on the right track. They saw it as a kind of intervention for Justin by people who had been there and done that. Martha really had no idea what she was getting herself into. She didn't realize that she would be roasted too. She sat on stage and heard jokes like, "Martha is so old, her first period was the Renaissance." All those rappers on stage, and Martha did the most jail time. But the thing is, Martha was actually funny. People loved her. She was sitting next to Snoop Dogg, and she said she was lit just by sitting next to him, and they got together after the show. Snoop said they both loved to love and they loved to teach. For a woman in her 80s, she has embraced social media. She's a hustler and she's shrewd. She has reinvented herself. They weren't expecting her to have that much of a sense of humor or willing to go socially incorrect with her jokes. At the end, Snoop stood up to applaud her. Martha and Snoop Dogg went on to host a cooking show on VH1 called Martha and Snoop's Potluck Dinner Party from 2016 to 2020, and they went to the 2026 Winter Olympics together. There's a painter who can be found on YouTube, and his name was Bob Ross. Unfortunately, he died in 1995, but he was on PBS for 11 years, and as he paints, he uses what he's learned from painting to give life advice. In one of his episodes, he said, "We don't make mistakes. We have happy accidents. Because very soon you learn to work with anything that happens here. And when you get over the fear of making a mistake, then life, becomes fun." At the end of the documentary, Martha said she doesn't want to put up with imperfections, but she's learned as she's gotten older that they are more okay for her now than they were when she was younger. Imperfection, she said, is something you can deal with, and that's a good thing. Next up will be the documentary review, The Glamorous Lie: Dangers of Being the Living Girlfriend.